Chapter 491. Imperial Tax. A world that should have been rich and beautiful, what a pity, the war. Galador's expression was somewhat emotional. But Lois saw it as somewhat fake in her eyes. This war apostle had witnessed countless wars firsthand, seen planets destroyed by war by the hundreds. Would he be moved by this? Moved my ass. Indeed, Galador himself didn't keep up the pretense for long. He hadn't really been pretending, he was merely reflecting. If Rage Owl Star were still in its heyday, I'm confident I could have secured donations exceeding 2 billion tax currency from here. Speaking of which, he truly became melancholic. Now, I can only scrape together 2 million. Lois listened on the side, without responding, indifferent. Indeed, it had little to do with her. She was a tax officer, as long as Rage Owl Star paid its taxes, that was all that mattered. Other issues like donations to the Empire's cause or the Sun Lord's expeditions, what did they have to do with her? In fact, she was rather annoyed by it all. 4 months ago, Galaraldo arrived at Dragonhawk Star Domain, visited the Star Domain head, and then came to her tax fleet, starting to follow her around the entire Dragonhawk Star Domain. She would collect taxes first, immediately afterwards, Galaraldo would seek out local notables for donations. Those he sought included star sector leaders and planetary governors as administrative chiefs, as well as factions like the Empire Commerce Guild, State Church, and Mechanical Cult Guild. When desperate, he would even approach local magnates of various planets. Generally, he could manage to raise some amount of money on each planet. This amount sometimes constituted half or even 1/10 of the imperial tax, and occasionally even exceeded the imperial tax, depending on the situation of the planet. And Galador's methods weren't limited to mere persuasion. The real gold and silver he demanded could amount to hundreds of millions or tens of billions of tax currency. The prestige of a Sun Lord, a war apostle, might be great, but you can't raise that kind of money just by trading on your face or your words. Essentially, it's still about power and cunning. He was officially authorized by the Empire. He could directly levy imperial tax within the Space Domain Government and Star Domain Government for the support of the Sun Lord's expeditions. The authority to directly commandeer imperial tax was immense. Consider this, under the Eastern Cosmos Domain to which Dragonhawk Star Domain belongs, there are 9 star domains, and under Dragonhawk Star Domain alone, there are 37 star sectors. Tianma as a star sector has an average annual imperial tax quota of around 12 billion tax currency. One tax currency is equivalent under Empire standards to the total annual output of an adult in a standard Terra year. From this perspective, one can imagine the enormous human and material resources at Galador's disposal. But this power was also limited, not absolute. He represented the will of the Sun Lord, no question, but the power of the Cosmos Domain heads is also significant. They even have the one-person one-vote power to elect an indeterminate number of representatives to enter into the Supreme Council of 13 of the Empire, representing the concentrated power of the Empire at a local level. They can veto the demands of a war apostle, and when the needs of the two parties conflict, they may argue back and forth, with issues escalating to the Supreme Council of the Empire if not resolved. Though backed by the greatest Sun Lord, airing all grievances before him would be quite unsightly, wouldn't it? This is where space for political bargaining and compromise exists. Galador isn't foolish, he has power but doesn't abuse it recklessly. For example, in the Eastern Cosmos Domain, the outcome of negotiations was that only 15% of the imperial tax would support the Sun Lord's expeditions. But what if that amount isn't enough? Well, then he would go from one star sector to another, from planet to planet, to solicit donations. And these methods weren't necessarily civilized. The Space Domain Government and Star Domain Government turned a blind eye to this, even providing assistance to a certain extent to prevent Galador from having further designs on the imperial tax. The imperial tax belongs to the Space and Star Domain governments. If Galador takes too much, they have less to use. But the money he raises from various star sectors and planets affects those places directly, which is relatively acceptable to the Space and Star Domain governments. And Galador relies on this support to do some rather distasteful things. For instance, if a planetary governor on a certain planet refuses his fundraising and doesn't give extra revenue, he might back the governor's rivals or even rebels to replace the incumbent. He would promise some Empire world magnates to leverage his relationship with the Mechanical Cult Guild to prioritize them for life extension surgeries. He could get his hands on some interstellar trade permits from the Empire Commerce Guild to sell to planetary merchants who lack qualifying rights but desire to engage in trade. He might even threaten some non-lifelong star sector heads, implying that if they want to be re-elected, they need to pay up. The methods are myriad. If it were just some underhanded tactics, some conspiracies, some political deals, well, that might be tolerable. But the problem is, many of his actions leave behind serious repercussions. The worst kind create local unrest. Some planets were already somewhat unstable, or even if they were peaceful, became turbulent after his meddling. He may have received his so-called donations, dusted off his pants and left, and typically the current imperial tax wouldn't have any major issues. But what about afterwards? The planets are still there, still under the administration of their respective star sectors, star domains, and cosmos domains. Left with a mess, subsequent issues either need the various levels of government to clean up, or if they can't handle it, even the next collection of imperial taxes will be affected. Chapter 492. Galaraldo had caused quite a stir in the Dragonhawk star domain in the past few months. If you want to make money, just make money, but after that, you leave a mess, and naturally, the internals of the Dragonhawk star domain government will have great discontent, they said. Among them, Nell Lavis was particularly unhappy. After all, Galaraldo had been acting alongside her tax fleet. Whatever this apostle of war did in the Dragonhawk star domain, she saw it all. She often had to clean up after Galaraldo, even getting dragged into the mess, so of course she wasn't pleased. But due to the status of the apostle of war, she dared not show her displeasure. But today, she could not hold back and wanted to say a few words. Your Excellency Apostle. I also roughly understand the situation of Rage Owl Star. It once got destroyed during wartime, and after being rebuilt, its population has always been small, the situation chaotic and dangerous, and the imperial tax it has to pay has always just been the minimum. Even so, this planet has failed to pay the full taxes for 8 consecutive years, and I've executed 4 planetary governors, she said. Their imperial tax due every 2 years amounts to only 10 million tax currency. This time, their star sector government covered 7.5 million for them, to give them time to recover and grow. Now, there's a new one who's arrived, and according to the message from Flying Wing Star, this new governor named Gu Hang is doing quite well. The entire planet is in the process of revival, and by the next term, they should be able to pay the taxes on their own abilities, she said. At this point, Lavis couldn't help but offer some advice. There's not much on this planet, so why bother scheming against them? Even if you squeeze them dry, you'd only get a few million tax currency. Let them develop on their own, she said. Galaraldo turned around, facing Lavis as if seeing her for the first time, sizing her up from head to toe. The gaze of the Apostle of War made Lavis somewhat uncomfortable. Suddenly, Galaraldo laughed. I never expected a tax officer known for making resolute decisions, not even blinking while executing planetary governors, to actually have a kind heart. His words carried a tinge of sarcasm. Lavis remained silent, not retorting. Galaraldo continued, You make sense, but, what of it? The development of a planet that has already been destroyed once is nothing compared to the grand undertaking of the solar expeditions. Why did I not go straight to the wealthiest flying wing star, the most populous Corolla 3, or the Fatches star system with 3 worlds around a single star upon arriving in the Tianma star sector, but instead choose Rage Owl star, this remote and poor place, as my first stop? He said. Because I am aware of the identity of that Gu Hang. I know he's the patriarch of an Empire Commerce Guild family, and what I can gain from him isn't just limited to whatever money there is on Rage Owl Star, his Gu family behind him has considerable wealth. Aside from the money, it's also an excellent place in the Tianma star sector to make a breakthrough. I also know he's been up to something on Hagian star in this star sector. I know he wants to establish a star realm army, to be responsible for the local defense of Rage Owl Star and concurrently to offset taxes. Look, this young man has lots of ideas. The more ideas he has, the more handles there are to grab hold of, he said. Based on my past experience, to do well and reap benefits in a star sector, one must first set an example. Whether it's a positive one, using incentives to establish a beneficiary who attracts others willing to make donations, or a negative one, overturning a place to make others consider the consequences through fear and force compliance, in any case, such an example must be set. And this Gu Hang, isn't he perfect for it? An impoverished, broken, and remote planet, and the governor just happens to represent a wealthy Empire Commerce Guild, along with some readily exploitable vulnerabilities. If I don't make this place my first stop, it would be a disservice to my keen instincts, he said. Faced with Galleraldo's lengthy discourse, Lavis fell silent as well. Of course, she still disagreed with the behavior of the Apostle of War. But what of it? As he said, it was just an insignificant little planet. With no conflict between the interests of the star domain and the interests of the tax officer, Lavis speaking up to offer advice was already a rare act of conscience. She couldn't possibly start a conflict with the Apostle of War over this. In the end, she could only sigh, thinking the kid named Guhang was somewhat unlucky. It would be best for him to be sensible, to shed some blood softly and send the Apostle of War on his way. Should he resist or refuse, then given Galleraldo's many methods, not only would the due blood still have to be shed, but there'd also be a host of additional problems. Guhang, as the tax officer, had prepared a grand welcome ceremony for the arrival of the Apostle of War. Of course, this grand celebration was only by the standards of Rage Owl Star. Rage Owl Star was quite poor, and under the Federation system, especially under the leadership of Governor Guhang, they never cared much for pomp and circumstance. Everything was oriented towards practicality, and any unnecessary ceremonies would be simplified as much as possible. However, when it came to receiving the War Apostle and the tax official of the Star Domain, they had managed to put on as much of a display as possible. They understood that this might still seem quite modest to the two worldly figures, and at best, it just conveyed the enthusiasm of Rage Owl Star. But reaching that point was sufficient, as long as it didn't give off a feeling of being overlooked. Essentially, Guhang had no intention of offending either of them. One was a war apostle with a prominent position on the Empire's political stage, and the other was a chief tax official who oversaw tax affairs within the Star Domain and had the power to execute planetary governors. Both were not people anyone could afford to offend. Moreover, Guhang had detected a particular scent. Their personal arrival was unusual. Based on common experience, an official of the tax chief's caliber had a very tight schedule. Typically, upon arriving at a stable star sector, they would directly station themselves in the star sector capital and take charge from the center. Sometimes they would personally visit some major tax-generating planets to supervise the situation. As for remote areas with low imperial tax quotas, it was enough for a detachment of the fleet to collect the taxes. If the taxes couldn't be collected, they would just issue an execution order, and the legal department's agents would take care of the rest. Guhang thought that he would only be dealing with a detachment of the fleet. But he could never have imagined that the chief tax official himself would come, and he brought a war apostle with him. Guhang felt that something was amiss. Secretly on alert, he personally received the two guests during the banquet and had an exchange with both of them. At one point, he considered using his spiritual energy ability to alter minds, to probe into what the two were thinking. However, as soon as he entertained this thought, he suddenly felt a twinge of palpitation. It was his spirituality, warning him. He immediately came to his senses. At the level of these two individuals, mental defenses would not be neglected. To carry out a silent and successful intervention without detection and without leaving any traces afterward would be extremely difficult. The chief tax official might possess some special artifact, and the war apostle emanated a strong divine radiance that made Guhang feel particularly apprehensive. He immediately extinguished the thought and focused solely on using conversation to probe them subtly. Nell Lavis, the tax official, was always serious and spoke little. Guhang couldn't glean much from him. In contrast, the higher-ranking war apostle was very approachable, always wearing a smile and lavishing praise on Guhang for his work on Rage Owl Star. During the brief conversation, Guhang was surprised to find that the war apostle knew quite a lot about his accomplishments over the past 2 years, if not in minute detail. Instead of feeling elated by the praise, he grew more vigilant. Such a significant figure knew so much about a minor governor on a remote planet. What are you up to? All throughout the banquet, this question plagued Guhang's mind. And at the end, as they parted ways, Lavis, the tax official, meaningfully sidestepped Galleraldo and whispered in his ear. The war apostle's requests must be fulfilled for your good and the good of your family. Chapter 493. Lois's final words almost made Guhang realize the problem he was about to encounter. It was indeed somewhat troublesome. But in fact, even though Guhang had already made an early judgment on Galleraldo's intentions, he found that he had still underestimated the war apostle's appetite in the end. Early the next morning, Ms. Lois, the chief tax inspector, was going to check the imperial tax that Rage Owl Star was about to pay the Legion with the code 43.25.09.03. The proper procedure was actually like this. The Tianma Star sector submitted a request to establish a new Star Realm Army Corps, citing the growing threat of Imperial traitors and green Skin Orcs on Rage Owl Star. It also listed the presence of green Skin Orc scouts on Rage Owl Star and enumerated the naval battle against green-skinned warships within the Rage Owl Star system. The application was approved. From that moment, Core 43.25.09.03, also known as the Rage Bear Legion, came into existence. Of course, this legion had no soldiers, no officers, no equipment. The Eastern War Zone of the Star Army issued a requisition to the Dragonhawk Star domain, establishing the Rage Bear Legion's various expenses would be borne by the Star Army, and the money spent by the Star Army would be paid from the Imperial taxes collected from the Dragonhawk Star domain. Isn't that convenient? The Imperial tax needed to establish the Rage Bear Legion just happened to equal 25% of the Imperial tax quota of Rage Owl Star. The remaining 75% had already been paid by the Star Sector government on behalf of Rage Owl Star. So according to the Joint Directive Guidance on the Proximity Principle regarding Imperial tax allocation issued by the Empire's Administrative Department and the Department of Taxation, Rage Owl Star would provide soldiers, equipment, and officers for the Rage Bear Legion on the spot. This whole operation was entirely legal and in compliance with all regulations, leaving nothing to be criticized. However, just because the procedure was flawless didn't mean that things were over. The rules for Imperial tax were very strict, and as an Imperial tax officer, it was necessary to inspect the army and assess whether the entire Rage Bear Legion was worth the 2.5 million tax currency. The assessment was very simple: each person was worth 5 tax currency, a soldier with full individual gear and qualified training was worth 10 tax currency. These military personnel, thus, had their price. Add to that the total cost of all the equipment, and that was the price for the whole Rage Bear Legion. While seemingly reasonable and a matter of simple arithmetic, in practice, there were far too many aspects that could be manipulated. The difference between the price of a soldier and an ordinary civilian was double. Who had the final say on whether a soldier truly qualified as a Star Realm army? This is where a representative of the Star Army, along with the tax officer and a representative from the Military Affairs Department, was needed to evaluate whether the soldiers' training met the standards. Strict adherence to the rules was, of course, to be expected, but why is it said that the Empire is corrupt? Since there were people in charge of evaluations and judgments, naturally, there were opportunities for foul play. Could the soldiers possibly not meet the qualifications? The standards of the Star Army were very high, and many worlds' local planetary defense forces simply didn't meet the level of the Star Army, with only a minority of elite troops from the defense forces qualifying. But using the planetary defense force to offset the requirements for the Star Army was still considered acceptable. In some places, when providing personnel reinforcements for the Star Army, they would simply dress civilians in military attire and give them basic training and weapons. Although against the rules, what happened in practice could vary. It depended on how the planetary governor conducted his affairs. Even in some places, this had become a semi-open secret. It was already fortunate if enough soldiers were provided without siphoning off ghost payrolls. Whether in some ancient feudal society, a modern society, or a cosmic empire that spanned the star sea like the Empire, as long as it involved humans, in human societies, such problems were nothing new. Similarly, for weapons and equipment, from something as small as a rifle, synthetic steel armor, to something as big as a lion tank, the Imperial Military Department had standard pricing. There was no room for nonsense here. However, was the equipment new? Old? Defective? What was the qualification rate? Was the production process compliant? Was the ammunition plentiful? The answers to these questions would affect the price of the weapons and equipment. Generally speaking, the joint tax collection teams from the Military Affairs Department, the Department of Taxation, and the Star Army representatives did not enforce strict scrutiny in these areas. The reason was simple: with imperial taxes amounting to tens or hundreds of millions, there were too many people and too many items to check each one individually. Sample checks thus became an inevitable method. Moreover, some discrepancies weren't necessarily due to malice on the part of the planetary governors or issues with their competence, but were objective realities making it impossible for everything to be perfect. An appearance of compliance was sufficient. This was not just a special case with the establishment of the Star Army on Rage Owl Star but also applied to regular tax collection. For human resources, a person had to be a healthy adult, but did vision problems count as healthy? Dental issues? Stuttering? Chronic illness? For material tax collection, the age of the grains, weaponry, equipment. If the rules were strictly adhered to, how many planetary governors would Lois have to execute after a round of tax collection? Turning a blind eye was necessary, and it couldn't even be considered corruption, but a necessary compromise with reality. If a planetary governor prepared a little extra on top of the original tax quota for redundancy, and the tax officers did not scrutinize to the death, it was sufficient for everyone to get by. Chapter 494. Furthermore, deciding whether to turn a blind eye depended on personal benefits received in the process. Of course, in practical terms, there were also situations where the rules were strictly adhered to. This situation typically arose when there was a person targeted for a takedown. Lois, along with many staff members led by Galleraldo, refused the Wind Falcon offered by the Alliance. Instead, they had their own spaceship. Coincidentally, it was a traveler. Gu Hang, as well as several top executives of the Alliance, were also asked not invited onto the tax fleet's traveler to head westward. The entire journey was expected to take less than 3 hours. Indeed, it was more than twice as fast as the Wind Falcon. On the spaceship, the Apostle of War spoke 2 pieces of information to Gu Hang. The first praised Gu Hang for his outstanding work on Rage Owl Star, developing it well, and also commended him for his exceptional performance on Hagian Star, stabilizing the most important Empire Commerce Guild power within the Tianma Star sector, the internal chaos of the Gu family. Although the Gu family had suffered some losses, they were now more united and stronger, with the future bound to be bright. Such a Gu family, in alliance with Rage Owl Star and Hagian Star, had great prospects for development and thus should provide more support to the great endeavors of the Empire. The most up-to-date noves are published on Frugnoelo. The figure for this support could be 3 billion tax currency. If Rage Owl Star, Hagian Star, and the Gu family jointly could afford this sum, as additional funding for the Empire's grand mission the Sun Expedition, then Galleraldo would be pleased, and he would consider Gu Hang a friend. The second message related to a specific current affair. He was disgusted with many of the rotten situations now emerging in the Empire, especially those tampering with the Star Realm army. He cited several examples from recent enforcement efforts, with some Star Realm armed forces units not meeting the expected standard of the Star Realm army. However, he believed that a rising star like Gu Hang, tasked with setting up a new Star Realm army corps, would certainly meet the requirements. Together, these 2 messages made Gu Hang's understanding of their meaning crystal clear. Give me 3 billion, and not only will I ignore whatever you want to do on Hagian Star, but I'll also provide you with some assistance. I'm well aware of all the dirty tricks you planetary governors play to dodge taxes with the Star Realm army. If you don't pay the 3 billion, forget about me making 100 problems for you later. Right now, don't even think about passing your Rage Bear Legion through inspections. After hearing these 2 messages, Gu Hang almost wanted to laugh in anger. The arrival of the Apostle of War, coupled with the tax officer's reminder, had led Gu Hang to anticipate that his position as the governor of the most destitute planet in the Tianma Star sector had marked him as a target for exploitation. He had even prepared for the possibility of losing money to avoid disaster. The premise was that the price wasn't too outrageous. But to start off with a demand for 3 billion? Even robbers weren't that fast. Clearly, Rage Owl Star could not afford such a price. The entire Alliance's annual output was just over 30 million tax currency, and even selling the whole of Rage Owl Star would not be enough to cover this amount. His target was the wealth of the Gu clan behind Gu Hang. The problem was, based on what Gu Hang knew about the Gu family's situation, they couldn't afford it either. The total annual revenue of the Gu family was around 10 billion tax currency, but most of this was spent as costs. The procurement of goods, transportation costs, labor costs, these took up the bulk. The Empire Commerce Guild certainly had to pay imperial tax as well, and they always imposed a flat rate of 10% of revenue without considering costs. Moreover, the Empire Commerce Guild was subject to many legal restrictions and many potentially highly profitable means they couldn't just use. Not to mention the high risks. Losing a ship full of cargo during interstellar travel meant compensating both buyers and sellers, and as ships were expensive, the losses were huge. Putting these aside, the net profit of the Gu commercial firm was around 3% a year, topping out at 3 billion. That includes the cost of risks. Given these returns, the Gu commercial firm was essentially working solely for the Empire. It seems like a lot was earned, but the bulk of it went to taxes, and less than 1/3 of the amount after taxes remained in hand. Galleraldo's demand for 3 billion amounted to the entire year's profit of the Gu commercial firm. Crucially, this profit wasn't the Gu family's to begin with, it belonged to the entire commercial association. The Gu commercial fleet was a franchise fleet, how could the Gu clan use the profits meant for those franchise fleets to donate to the Sun expedition? People would rebel against them in an instant. Already weakened by the internal strife, the Gu family had lost 2 of their 14 merchant fleets, and the remaining 12 were down 18 various commercial vessels. To lose another 3 billion. They couldn't afford it. Unless they sold ships. Gu Heng would certainly not approach his mother with such a request. Selling ships from the commercial fleet? What a joke! Gu Heng had no intention of satisfying Galleraldo's greed, which was far greater than he had imagined. Of course, he also chose not to reject him outright. First, stall for your time. You, Galleraldo, are a busy man, how long can you stay in the Tianma Star sector? Just drag it out for now. The longer the delay, even if it leads to a fallout in the end, the less time he will have to cause trouble. If it really comes to it, regarding the affairs of Gu commercial firm, let him talk to Wang Qi. As for the current threat of whether the Rage Bear Legion can be established. Sorry, Gu Heng is not afraid in the slightest. Perhaps, other planetary governors have all kinds of tricks up their sleeve when dealing with the Star Realm Army's tax deduction matters. But with Gu Heng, it's all legitimate. Go ahead and investigate. It would be impressive if you could find even one unqualified soldier or a single piece of substandard weaponry after your scrutiny. In front of Galleraldo, Gu Heng chuckled, beat around the bush, and avoided a direct response. Galleraldo understood Gu Heng's intentions. But he wasn't very angry, instead, a smile remained on his face. The youngster is still naive, unaware of how treacherous the world can be. Bring it on. He had encountered such situations many times before. Some people just wouldn't come to their senses without a coffin in sight. Without a shock from an imperial senior official, they never wake up to reality. Having understood Gu Heng's intentions, Galleraldo didn't say much anymore, simply reclining in his chair and resting with his eyes closed. And soon, they arrived at their destination. The Rage Bear Legion had already assembled. The Beast Slaughter Brigade, the 11th 14th Infantry Divisions, the 26th 33rd Infantry Divisions, the 35th Composite Brigade, all were in place. It was also lucky that there hadn't been any conflicts in the Western War Zone previously, and Blackbird Heavy Industries' combat power had temporarily been pushed even further west. Otherwise, pulling these 13 division and brigade-level units from the defensive line for an inspection would indeed have been difficult. During the previous battles, these 13 units planned for the Rage Bear Legion had all suffered some loss of personnel and equipment. Gu Heng had long since ordered the logistics department to prioritize their resupply of troops and equipment. By now, these 13 divisions and brigades were at full strength. During the descent from the sky, the smile that had been on Galleraldo's face slowly faded away. How could a war apostle, a high-ranking official who rose from the vast battles of the Sun Lord's far-reaching campaigns, one of the Sun Lord's confidants, be a simpleton? Merely from the bird's-eye view, looking down at the military formation, he caught a glimpse that told him this force was special. Though the formal inspection had not yet begun, the military demeanor and appearance of the Rage Bear Legion had already left a deep impression on him. But at that moment, he still regarded this army as mere window dressing. The reason was simple: how could a soldier of the Star Realm Army's standard be so easily trained? It required not only selecting outstanding soldiers but also long periods of tactical training. How could this Gu Heng, who had only been in charge of the Rage Owl Star for 2 years, possibly train a truly strong force given the previous dismal state of the planet? After landing, he pulled over the representative from the Star Realm Armed Forces who came with the delegation and whispered something to him. The other party nodded, indicating understanding. Then, the inspection began. Chapter 495. Galleraldo also personally participated in the inspection. The entire Rage Bear Legion looked quite imposing, but no matter what, Galleraldo did not believe that Rage Owl Star could cultivate such an army in a short period of time. He insisted on lifting the veil of this army to see if there was anything flawed hidden beneath its splendid exterior. However, when the Rage Bear Legion began to carry out collective tactical drills according to the standards, the more Galleraldo watched, the more something seemed off. This wasn't just about military bearing and appearance. Though these tactical drills weren't actual combat, a significant portion of an army's combat effectiveness came from its discipline and organizational skills. And what was demonstrated in just 2 short hours represented discipline and organization that was indeed not bad and indeed reached the level expected of the Star Realm Army. At this moment, Galleraldo had already dismissed many of his illusions. Galleraldo was somewhat surprised. But it was still too soon to draw conclusions now. Even if the discipline and organizational standards were met, there was another key element: individual soldier quality. That was the hardest part. Could you also excel at this? Galleraldo glanced at the edge of his vision, where Mr. Gu, with his confident appearance, gave Galleraldo some assurance. It seemed that it wouldn't be difficult to trouble Gu Heng on this matter. Indeed, that was the case. During the individual soldier quality and equipment testing phases, the representatives from the Star Realm Army and the officials from the Military Affairs Department, after their inspections, came back and slightly shook their heads to the War Apostle. They had inspected the soldiers of various arms with the strictest criteria and without any leniency, as instructed by the War Apostle. It was so thorough that even the Logistics Battalion, the Engineering Battalion, and the Communications Company were pulled out for inspection. These checks included physical fitness aspects such as strength, load-bearing, and running, verbal orders and responses, random knowledge checks, and tactical thinking questions in the military sphere, as well as assessments of shooting skills and specialty capabilities within each branch of the military. But, under the considerably high ratio of their random checks, the very worst soldiers in terms of individual soldier qualities also met the minimum criteria required by the Star Realm Army, and many even surpassed them. The Military Affairs Department officials and the Star Realm Army representative were shocked themselves, even suspecting at one point whether the inspectors they had sent out had been bribed, and heavily bribed at that, to produce such unbelievable results. Even a fully compliant Star Realm Army Corps could not possibly have such a high pass rate. After all, the Star Realm Army was a massive group. Some soldiers with outstanding combat achievements might forget certain regulations, and some soldiers who performed exceptionally in specific positions, such as those with excellent driving skills, might lag slightly in physical fitness. In fact, the Star Realm Army's standard inspections did not require everyone to pass. It would indeed be too much to ask for, it only needed a certain pass rate to be acceptable. But even if they used impossibly high standards, they found no issues. Both representatives were embarrassed but had no choice but to believe the results were true. Because the parts they themselves inspected turned out the same. They didn't dare to call white black, the metrics were right there in plain sight. Fudging the numbers was not just bending the unwritten rules, it was outright violation of the rules in broad daylight, which would change the nature of the offense. They were not directly subordinated to Galleraldo, instead, they were closer to Nel Lavis and didn't wish to create difficulties for Galleraldo's sake. Besides, the War Apostle had only asked them to strictly enforce the Empire's regulations, and they had done so. Without finding anything wrong, what could they do? This certainly wasn't our fault. When they reported back to the Warlord, they were quite composed. They had been prepared to fall back on Tax Commissioner Lavis and the Empire's regulations in case the Warlord was dissatisfied. To their surprise, Galleraldo simply nodded to show he understood and had no other reaction. That was certainly for the best, so they proceeded with the normal process. The calculated value of the equipment and personnel totaled 2,819,900. That was over 300,000 more than the 2.5 million tax currency Rage Owl Star was supposed to pay. Without a second word, Lavis issued the extra 30-odd thousand directly to Gu Heng, in accordance with the Empire's regulations. That was over 30,000 pieces of special paper. Each bore intricate patterns, a portrait of the Divine Emperor on the front, and an overhead view of the human ancestral star on the back. Each was worth 1 tax currency. Their special anti-forgery symbols resulted from the endorsement of 3 powers within the Empire. The paper layers produced by the Mechanical Cult Guild contained special electromagnetic signals. When soaked in the holy water of the state religion, they showed a unique blessed reaction, and the patterns engraved by the Psychic Cultivators Association through the Spirit Network contained spiritual energy response. This meant the tax currency was almost impossible to counterfeit. Furthermore, the distribution of imperial tax currency was extremely strict. While various star sectors dealt with billions of tax currency, in reality, most of the time, tax currency was used merely as a measure of the value of goods and even human resources. Genuine tax currency was rarely circulated. The reason was simple: to get the circulating tax currency, one must pay extra taxes beyond the Empire's set tax standards. This part, no matter how much is overpaid, is issued as tax currency, which can be used for future tax deductions. All circulating tax currency, in the strictest sense, was backed 1:1 by the actual goods tax, circulated only after an excess payment. Chapter 496. The question then arises, many planets already find it difficult to pay their taxes, what room is there for additional payments? Not to mention, even if they had the money, why would they pay extra? Tax currency is the same when you get it in hand, you can offset it against your taxes 1-to-1, with no interest gained. In the past, Lois certainly wouldn't have approved the issuance of tax currency so easily. But this time was different. After the order was issued, a subordinate hesitated before reporting to her, Commander-in-Chief, according to our usual practice, for the kind of surplus that is obviously prepared by the planetary governor in order to achieve the tax target and avoid accidents, we never issue additional tax currency for that, especially not in the mode of offsetting with Star Realm military personnel as taxes, right? Lois looked at the official indifferently and said, can the situations be the same? With those so-called precedents, we've encountered governors who substitute inferior goods for good ones, with a rather high rate of non-compliance. We've turned a blind eye, we've already given them enough face, it's unreasonable to issue them extra tax currency. After a pause, Lois continued, but this time it's different, even by the strictest standards, he has paid the full amount of taxes. Gu Hang's kid, he's really honest. Lois could only use that word to describe it. In her long career as a tax officer, she seldom saw governors pay imperial tax so honestly. No haggling, no extra trouble, saving lots of issues. Lois thought that if all planetary governors could abide by the rules like this, it would be great. She wouldn't have had to undergo 3 life extension surgeries to live to 200. To her, if Gu Hang followed the rules, so would she. She would pay the full amount of tax currency due. The next steps were relatively simple. Unlike tax collection elsewhere, where haggling over the value of goods and dealing with various political traits was necessary, for Lois, the tax work on Rage Owl Star was quite trouble-free and efficient. The only thing left to do was the final step, after her approval as the tax officer, solving the tax issues of Rage Owl Star. The Rage Bear Legion was officially established. The representatives from the Star Realm Army and the Military Affairs Department would represent the Star Realm Army, appointing a Legion commander. This appointment had already been prepared, the candidate reported by Gu Hang, Yan Fangxiu. Of course, things did not go entirely Gu Hang's way. He had first proposed that Yan Fangxiu, with the rank of Major General of the Rage Owl Star Defense Forces, keep his rank when transferring to command the Legion. After all, the Planetary Defense Force is an officially recognized Imperial Army, so it would make sense for the rank to be transferable, wouldn't it? The Star Realm Army did not think it was reasonable. You think you can become a Star Realm Army brigadier with what you've got? Commanding a legion of less than 150,000 people, and being a colonel is already something. After all, this colonel can manage the internal affairs of the Rage Bear Legion, appoint officers and grant ranks up to lieutenant colonel still subject to reporting. However, just when everything was ready, and the awarding ceremony was about to begin, an unexpected event occurred. Galaraldo arrived. At the sight of this apostle of war, Lois internally rolled her eyes. After verifying that Rage Owl Star's military completely met the Star Realm Army's paper standards, and there were no issues even under the most stringent checks, the apostle of war calmed down. Lois had thought he would continue on like this. But, in the end, this deity still made his move at the last moment. Disapproval. But of course, she wouldn't show such emotions externally. She maintained her usual stern, serious demeanor and asked, Apostle of War, do you have any objections? Yes, of course, I do, Galaraldo said with a smile. I don't think Yan Fangxiu is suitable for the position of commander of this Star Realm Army Legion. As expected, he was going to cause trouble. Lois sighed internally without changing her expression, and said, this appointment comes directly from the Star Domain military headquarters of the Dragonhawk Legion, you have no right to interfere. At this point, she finally showed a bit of sharpness. Moreover, if you tamper with this matter, that would be overstepping the line. Rest assured, how could I? I won't arrange for one of my people to assume the role of commander of the Rage Bear Legion, thereby gaining control of this army through underhanded means. I have great respect for the Star Domain government, and for the control of the Star Realm Army in this Star Domain, you can be assured of that, Galaraldo replied. Upon hearing what Galaraldo had said, Lois' attitude became slightly less guarded. It dispelled her greatest concern. The Rage Bear Legion had become a property of the Dragonhawk Star Domain, and under the existing framework of rules, this army was governed by the Dragonhawk Legion Star Realm Army headquarters. If Galaraldo had designs in this regard, it would step on the Star Domain's bottom line. Since Galaraldo had no such intentions, Lois felt much more at ease. But she was puzzled. Then who do you intend to nominate as the commander of this legion after cancelling Yan Fangxiu's appointment? Gu Hang, said the War Apostle with a smile, I have already contacted the Dragonhawk Star Domain Military Affairs Department, and they have agreed. Lois was speechless. What more was there for her to say? The Rage Bear Legion hadn't been pulled away and still belonged to the Order of the Dragonhawk Star Domain Star Realm Army. A planetary governor holding the concurrent position of a Legion commander in the Star Realm Army was unusual, but there were precedents. For some Star Realm armies that drew their primary military personnel from a single planet, it was sometimes the case that a planetary governor was appointed to this position. In a sense, to such a person, the identity of a Legion commander was even more important than that of a planetary governor. Appointing a Legion commander as planetary governor was to enable the planet's forces to better serve the Imperial Army. For instance, the famous Kadian Assault Corps, the Creek Death Corps. From the Star Domain standpoint, indeed there wasn't much reason to oppose such an appointment, and it was not unreasonable for the Dragonhawk Star Domain government to agree to the request. But Lois knew it wasn't so simple. Galaraldo was full of nefarious schemes. But she could do no more. Gu Hang's expression was extremely sour when he received the appointment letter and became a Star Realm Army brigadier. Facing the smiling Galaraldo and the apologetic Lois standing behind him, he opened his mouth, wanting to say he refused. But Galaraldo cut him off. You can't refuse, said Galaraldo, the morale and level of expertise of the Rage Bear Legion have truly moved me. Mr. Gu deserves reward for establishing such a formidable force from ruins. I originally intended to secure you a major general rank, but unfortunately, the Dragonhawk Star Domain Military Affairs Department was only willing to approve the rank of brigadier. I even quarreled with them over this. He seemed so amiable, as if he had Gu Hang's best interests at heart, which made Gu Hang feel nauseated. One nasty trick after another. What could go wrong with Gu Hang serving as the commander of the Rage Bear Legion? Loads of trouble. The current objective of the Rage Bear Legion was to be stationed at Rage Owl Star, that wasn't a problem. But what about in the future? If the Rage Bear Legion were to be deployed elsewhere to fight, Gu Hang could appoint another commander to lead the team and not have to go himself. But that was under normal circumstances. If the Military Affairs Department specifically ordered it, however, Gu Hang would have no choice but to go. Galaraldo was warning him in this manner. If I have the power to change the appointment and nominate you as the Legion commander, do you think I lack the ability to change the orders for the Rage Bear Legion, to send it somewhere else to fight, and make it impossible for you to leave your planet? This move was despicable. Seeing the look on Gu Hang's face, Galaraldo's smile brightened. The next battle for the Rage Bear Legion will be at Karolia 3. That's the most densely populated planet in the Tianma star sector, and its unrest truly troubles me, precisely the kind of situation that needs the Rage Bear Legion's assistance. Listening to these words, Gu Hang's eyes narrowed. Galaraldo's behavior truly incited a murderous intent in Gu Hang. Chapter 497. Galaraldo could certainly see that Gu Hang now despised him to the extreme. But he was all too accustomed to this feeling. Over the past years, for the Sun Expedition, collecting extra war resources, he had used so many methods that were far from honorable, and the people he had offended were far too numerous. From the elites on the planets, to the planetary governors or other Empire officers, up to the core members of certain major forces. But so what? His backing was the Sun Lord, the living saint favored by the Emperor, the de facto ruler of the Empire. Who dares to touch me? Nobody could do anything to him through legitimate channels. Any lawsuits pursued up the chain would never end in his defeat. What about illegitimate means? He wasn't afraid of assassination. For such matters, he had experience, for many had wanted him dead, and not a few had tried. He appeared relaxed and careless on the surface, but he was actually very cautious in this regard. Moreover, killing him would not be so easy. The Sun Lord was the most favored and powerful living saint within the Empire, a being capable of confronting and even obliterating the great demon. And he, as the Sun Lord's apostle of war, was also graced with divine favor. Even if the blessing were only 1% of that of the Sun Lord, he was certainly not someone who could be casually assassinated. Poisons, blades, bullets, none of these could claim his life. Silently killing him was near impossible. As for rebellion, military ambush, even less likely. Who would dare? Take, for instance, Mr. Gu here, itching with hatred. If he were to order his 150,000 troops to fire upon me, then indeed I would die here. That would be an inescapable conclusion. Then Gu Hang would have to die. Not just Gu Hang, almost the entire Rage Owl Star would have to be buried with me. This wasn't just a matter of one person's life, but a question of the Sun Lord's dignity. I am here on behalf of the Sun Lord, one of the 46 apostles of war. My death anywhere would be a matter of great consequence. Escape blame? Impossible. Even if Galaraldo truly choked to death on a sip of water, as long as it happened within the Rage Owl star system, Gu Heng would be held responsible. He would have to die. Of course, Galaraldo never underestimated the madness of others. Therefore, he never pushed people to their breaking point. He offered Gu Heng a reasonable deal. Look, I've granted you the rank of Star Realm Army Brigadier, allowing you to better control the Rage Bear Legion. I can turn a blind eye to whatever you're doing on Hagian Star, even instructing the Imperial tax officials to ignore it, as long as you pay your taxes. Moreover, aren't you waging a war here? I can order the tax fleet to fire a few shots at Blackbird City when leaving. The firepower of 3 destroyers is far superior to that little naval cutter you have floating above. All you need to do is pay 3 billion. Although these things are far from worth 3 billion, when you take into account your legion might be relocated, you might be reassigned, your actions on Hagian Star might be labeled as rebellion against the Empire world, the commerce fleet of your family might be restricted. All things considered, wouldn't it then be worth 3 billion? I'm not pushing you to the edge. Galaraldo was confident in his plan. Harboring thoughts of murder wasn't just talk, nor was it a mere burst of anger in response to being targeted, it was a strategy, a method, carefully assessed amid rationality and calmness. Assassination, creating accidental death, was of course a viable political tool. Gu Heng had not shied away from it in the past and didn't exclude its use in the future. It wasn't the righteous path, but sometimes one needed to rely on unconventional means. The assessment focused on 2 points. First, the feasibility of killing him. Second, the benefits and risks of killing him. If Galaraldo had to die, there could be no slip-ups, whether success or failure, it must not be connected to oneself, and he certainly could not die within the Rage Owl star system. Otherwise, it would be a complete disaster. Even if the Empire government, with the Sun Lord's more reasonable nature, and Gu Heng's utmost secrecy, such a significant event would inevitably result in an investigation. And on Rage Owl Star, Gu Heng had too many secrets. Even if the death of the War Apostle was not traced back to him, the discovery of any other matter would be unbearable for him. The biggest issue was the black box. By now, Gu Heng had been able to exchange for many of them, the smaller ones were manageable, but the large ones, as big as workshops in some factories, were impossible to hide. Once the Empire's investigation began, there would be no hiding them, and Gu Heng couldn't possibly slaughter every Empire investigator who came to Rage Owl Star. He had no intention of pulling Galaraldo into a mutual destruction. But it was not entirely without hope. As long as the War Apostle visited Karolia 3. As for the benefits and risks of killing the War Apostle, the benefits were practically non-existent. After much thought, Gu Heng found it difficult to discern any additional gains he might receive from this act. What he did was merely for self-preservation. Money was one aspect, but the feeling this man gave Gu Heng was too terrible. He even had the feeling that even if he now consulted with his mother and decided that the Gu family would go so far as to sell iron pots, regardless of the detrimental effect this would have on Wang Qi control over the Chamber of Commerce fleet, they'd scrape together the 3 billion by forcefully selling a few ships. But in the end, the outcome would probably not be much better. 3 billion sounds like a lot, but for an operation the scale of the Sun Expedition, what's that but a mere trifle? Chapter 498. The tremendous expenditure indicated that Galaraldo, under the responsibilities of his own position, would harbor a great, insatiable greed even if it wasn't for his own benefit. And after Galaraldo felt he had Gu Heng in his grasp, would he really be content with just the 300 million in the future? If Gu Heng appeared weak, would this guy seize any opportunity to extort him now and then using this or that pretext? By then, the dividends of Rage Owl Star's development and the hard-earned profits of the Gu family would all fall prey to this man's predatory exploitation. This was something Gu Heng could not accept, and it was precisely the reason he had to eliminate him. Time to get down to it. But not now. He still had to wait until the man left Rage Owl Star before taking action. Galaraldo and Lois didn't have much time to waste on Rage Owl Star. The two of them, one aimed to make money, and the other to collect taxes. Lois had to traverse the entire Dragonhawk star domain, covering 37 star sectors and a total of 557 worlds within 2 years. On average, the maximum time he could wait in each star sector was just 2 or 3 weeks. Galleraldo was even more pressed to make money, finding it difficult to stay in the same cosmos domain for more than a year or two. It was only because the Tianma star sector was relatively affluent that he was willing to stay a bit longer. As for poorer places, he wouldn't even bother visiting them. Rage Owl Star was an exception, as he saw it as a breakthrough point and a place to make money from the Gu family behind Gu Hang. After reviewing the troops and completing the appointment of a small legion, they were ready to leave. Before Galleraldo departed, he left Gu Hang with a clear message. Mr. Gu, perhaps you don't yet understand the significance of the Empire's great cause for each individual, but I believe you will eventually comprehend and be willing to give everything to support the Sun Lord. I'll be in the Tianma Star sector for 2 weeks, waiting for your news. After saying these words, he kindly did Gu Hang a favor. A division of the tax fleet, consisting of 3 destroyers, circled Rage Owl Star's orbit and on the other side, launched an orbital strike towards Blackbird City. The core district of Blackbird City, which had held up remarkably well against the Blade Tiger, saw its energy shield turn from blue to red after just one barrage from the 3 destroyers. This was the difference between an energy shield and a void shield. The latter, even if completely overloaded and turning red, could still intercept attacks within its capacity, with only those it couldn't stop falling through. An energy shield, on the other hand, was utterly useless once breached. Despite some orbital anti-air firepower within Blackbird City, it was clearly insufficient to fully stop the destroyer's assault. They couldn't even handle the Blade Tiger, let alone 3 destroyers. At this point, if the destroyers in the sky put in a bit more effort and launched another round or 2 of attacks, the shield of Blackbird City's core district would inevitably collapse. After that, even if the destroyers left, the Blade Tiger alone could destroy the heart of Blackbird City. But at that moment, the 3 destroyers drifted away. When Gu Hang received this news, he was furious, gritting his teeth. Having refused Galleraldo's extortion, he no longer expected the tax fleet to help solve the problem. But the other party's attitude was even more infuriating. He could almost hear Galleraldo taunting him with a jesting laugh, "See, I could help you a lot, as long as you kneel down obediently." Gu Hang bowed his head submissively, "Very well, Apostle of War, thank you for the gift you left me before departing. When we both arrive at Corollia, I will return the favor." Just one day after Galleraldo's departure, the Star Realm Army Dragonhawk Command issued an order. The Rage Bear Legion and Dragonhawk 3rd Legion were to cooperate and quell the Ironman rebellion on Rage Owl Star within 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, no matter the situation on Rage Owl Star, the Rage Bear Legion must at least withdraw half its forces to Corollia 3 to address the growing chaos of the rebellion there. In the past, Rage Owl Star had never had any interaction with the Imperial Star Realm Army, but starting today, the situation was utterly different. The Rage Bear Legion was now a part of the Star Realm Army. Although it was an independent legion, it had to follow the directives of the local command, namely, the Star Domain Headquarters. These directives wouldn't involve specifics of combat, but they would pertain to troop deployments and mission assignments. Galleraldo indeed wasn't the type to push people to their deaths. This campaign to support Corollia 3 didn't require the entire Rage Bear Legion, it didn't demand the presence of Gu Hang, the Legion commander. It thoughtfully considered the ongoing rebellion on Rage Owl Star and didn't demand immediate action, granting a 2-week grace period. But no matter how you look at it, this was undoubtedly a vexing decision. Within the Tianma Star sector, there was only one force from the Star Realm Army before this, Dragonhawk 3rd Legion. They were mainly stationed on 3 planets in the Fatches star system, with a scale of 20 million. To deal with the issue on Corollia 3, what use would the 15,000 men from the Rage Bear Legion be? If anything, it should be the bona fide Dragonhawk Legion that was called. Most of the Dragonhawk Legion was still lying down in the Fatches star sector, a smaller part had gone to Corollia 3, and an even smaller segment was about to arrive at Rage Owl Star. To not even deploy the forces headed for Rage Owl Star and instead have them quell the Iron Men rebellion, while sending troops from Rage Owl Star to Corollia 3, wasn't that like dropping your pants just to fart? It was clearly targeting Gu Hang. When Gu Hang synchronized this matter with Yan Fangxiu, Major General Yan, still primarily recognized by his Rage Owl Star military rank internally, was utterly baffled. In 2 weeks, his Rage Bear Legion would be halved in size? "Mr. Governor, this will put a lot of pressure on our attack, and we'll face a shortage of troops," he said. "Don't worry," Gu Hang maintained a confident facade in front of his subordinates. "Tithes will be commissioned to start the construction of 9 new division and brigade level units, totaling over 130,000 people. Yan Fangxiu did the calculations. Following Gu Hang's plan, they would extract 7 divisions to complete the deployment commanded by Dragonhawk Command, and now they would be reinforced with 9 new divisions. Overall, it seemed the Alliance's troop count would definitely be on the rise. However, this meant that the manpower pool released under the second-level mobilization order had begun to be utilized. This certainly was not a good signal, as it meant the overall production capacity of the Alliance was going to be impacted due to the workforce joining the military. Although under the second-level mobilization order, this impact was still relatively mild, Gu Heng did not want the situation to worsen further. In his exchange with Yan Fangxiu, he was open about this issue. This is the largest force the Alliance can commit without affecting production. In the short term, this is also the last additional force. You must use our military carefully and coordinate well with the Dragonhawk Legion that will follow, he said. Yan Fangxiu was somewhat somber. He understood what this meant. The forces at his disposal had reached their limit, there would be no more numbers allocated for his use. Even future unit casualties might impact the replenishment of troops. But he knew that this certainly wasn't Mr. Gu's fault. He sighed, let's hope that Star Realm Army is dependable enough. The Dragonhawk 3rd Legion arrived on time. 3 days after the departure of the tax fleet, they reached Rage Owl Star. They were brought here by the transport ships of the Gu family and armed merchant ships. Of course, it wasn't a free service exploiting the family fleet. Transporting the Star Realm Army was a transportation order from the Empire Commerce Guild to the Gu commercial firm, which was paid for though the profit margin was very low. But as long as there was pay, it wasn't freeloading. The contingent brought on this fleet amounted to 300,000 people. The arrival of these troops allowed Gu Heng and Yan Fangxiu to breathe a sigh of relief. According to the latest news, a second batch of troops had already departed from the Fascist Star system, with 700,000 men. 1 million troops in total from the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion allocated for dispatch. With this, there was no longer any worry for local combat on Rage Owl Star. Chapter 499. Another 700,000 soldiers of the Star Realm Army were embarking in the Fascist Star system, and the estimated arrival time was 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, the 300,000 troops of the Star Realm Army that had already arrived at Rage Owl Star Port were disembarking in succession. The starport on Rage Owl Star was still small scale, and its capacity for personnel throughput wasn't quite adequate. Moreover, the journey from Skaro City, part of the starport on the ground, to the front line in the western desert by vehicle was a good few thousand kilometers. Even though there were paved roads built during the previous alliance's major infrastructure constructions, and sufficient logistical supplies were available along the way, ensuring speed was not slow, it still took a relatively long time for the 300,000 troops to arrive and deploy sequentially. 2 weeks had passed, and they had just taken their positions. During the wait for them to be in place, it was time for the 7 divisions of the Rage Bear Legion to leave. According to the orders from Dragonhawk Command, it was time for them to depart. The transport ships of the Gu commercial firm, which had brought the Dragonhawk 3rd Corps to Rage Owl Star, were still docked at the ports of the Rage Owl Star system. In fact, on their way there, they had received a new order, to transport the 7 divisions of the Rage Bear Legion, a total of 77,000 people, away from Rage Owl Star to Karolia 3. This was conveniently on the way. Gu Heng was also going. The orders from Star Realm Army Command were not related to him, so naturally, he could choose not to go. However, after a conversation with his mother, he realized that the opportunity he was looking for had come even faster than he had expected. After leaving Rage Owl Star, Galaraldo would make a brief stop at Flying Wing Star to meet some people, then he would proceed to Karolia No. 3 planet under the pretense of inspecting the spread of the Chaos Plague. Of course, he wasn't so benevolent. In reality, dealing with the Chaos Plague and quelling the Chaos Rebellion were not the responsibilities of this apostle of war. He was going to make money. Karolia 3 was suffering, and looking at the current situation, in a nest capital on Karolia covering a population of 1 billion, the plague had become unstoppable. It had nearly become a fallen area, with a large number of planetary defense forces battling within. Rebels and plague-infected corpses were emerging there in endless numbers. To say that the entire planet's resources couldn't suppress this would be impossible. Karolia was a huge planet with a population of 40 billion. But they dared not pull too many personnel from other nests to aid the areas infected with the Chaos Plague. What if other nests encountered problems too? Actually, by then, there were already reports of sporadic infections in other nests. And with Karolia III's response capability, once an official report surfaced, in the underworld of the nests, the number of infected might well be 100 times the reported figures. Even the planetary government of Karolia III was considering launching an extermination strike on the infected city. This was only a proposal for the time being and still in the discussion phase, with many objections. A billion people, could one simply decide to give them up? What a joke! Even disregarding any humanity, just by looking at interests alone, this would be 5 billion tax currency. From these perspectives, one could see that the dilemma Karolia III was facing was indeed no small matter. For others, there were those who found humor in the situation, those who lamented and sympathized with the people, and those worried that the deteriorating situation there might trigger even bigger trouble. But there were also those who would exploit the disaster as leverage, not only withholding aid but also taking advantage of it. Like Galaraldo, for instance. This guy came sniffing around where there was the scent of blood. Under the guise of inspecting the spread of the chaos plague, he actually intended to have the leaders of the Star Sector and the Karolia governor pay a hefty sum of money. This money was for buying safety. If they didn't pay, he would then stir up trouble for these two officials by accusing them of allowing the chaos to spread unchecked due to their inefficacy. Chaos corruption within the empire was considered to be a serious matter. Generally, if a planetary governor could handle it themselves without escalating it, then all was well. If it did escalate and caught the attention of superiors, there was a chance the planetary governor could be dismissed, especially after the arrival of high-ranking officials. While Galaraldo did not have the authority to dismiss a planetary governor, he could use the leverage to blow the issue out of proportion. Especially after Galaraldo heard that the Karolia government was considering an extermination approach to the nest, willing to sacrifice 1 billion people, he saw it as a priceless opportunity and used it as his primary leverage, taking the moral high ground to berate the Karolia government for not valuing the lives of the empire's citizens. Miss Wang Qi even repeated Galaraldo's exact words to Gu Hang. "That's 1 billion lives. I don't know how you can even utter such a suggestion." Gu Hang didn't believe Galaraldo truly cared about human life, but without a doubt, it had become his most powerful weapon of criticism. Following the current trajectory, from Pei Desi, the head of the Star Sector, to the Karolia governor, if they didn't provide a satisfactory response, they could very well be in deep trouble. The discussion meeting that Galaraldo was planning to hold on Karolia III was merely a stage. He sent out widespread invitations, and prominent figures from the Tianma Star Sector all received one. They would serve as the audience for a show where Galaraldo played the leading role. If Pei Desi and the Karolia governor complied, then it would be a serious meeting for upper echelon inspection and work guidance. If not, it would turn into a trial where a war apostle criticized derelict and corrupt local officials. Chapter 500. The Gu family had certainly received the invitation as well, earnestly inviting Gu Hang and his mother Wang Qi to attend together. Given previous events, Gu Hang took it as a sign that Galaraldo was showing them a display of power. "I can easily manipulate both the leader and the governor of the largest planet, and I haven't come down hard on you, the Gu clan. Don't fail to recognize what's good for you." Originally, Wang Qi had advised her son not to attend, saying that she could handle it herself. But Gu Hang decided to go. "If you get yourself killed, don't blame me." Before leaving, there were matters on Rage Owl Star that needed to be addressed. For governmental affairs, he spent a good while talking to Ozania. Lambert was put in charge of law and order as well as maintaining stability. The military aspects would be managed by Yan Fangxiu and Tadeus. After giving each of them careful instructions, Gu Hang then departed. He estimated that his trip would take at least a month. He had considerable trust in the alliance government system he had established. Even in his absence, those individuals could maintain stability for several months without issues. The only thing he was somewhat concerned about was the situation on the Western Front. Even though substantial forces from the Star Realm Army would come to support, that wasn't necessarily all good. He had learned that the Star Realm Army commander arriving there was an Imperial Major General. With a high military rank and being from the Star Realm Army, the commander naturally had an advantage over the Planetary Defense Force. If the Major General worked efficiently, there would be no issue, but Gu Hang feared that trouble might arise. However, he had made preparations for this matter as well. He just hoped that he wouldn't need to use them. After all, since the other party was there to help, creating any conflict was not what Gu Hang intended. If they could smoothly utilize the superior military force to flatten Blackbird Heavy Industries on the western side of the continent, that would be ideal. For this reason, he had specially contacted Yelazaya one more time. Technically, after completing the first phase of the Imperial tax on Rage Owl Star, Yelazaya and her ships should have departed. The original order she had accepted was to station in orbit around Rage Owl Star for 2 years. Now that the 2-year period had ended, it was time for her to leave. But at Gu Hang's request, and given that a new order from Tianma Fleet Command had not yet been issued, Yelazia considered for a while and ultimately agreed to his request. 9 days later, Karolia 3, Salt City. This was the largest nest capital on Karolia, inhabited by 3 billion people. It was a giant honeycomb-like structure. The lower half had nearly hollowed out the earth, the upper half was an immense multi-tiered structure, piercing into the skies. Before seeing it with his own eyes, Gu Hang had always found it difficult to believe how a city could possibly accommodate 3 billion people. Now he knew. It was indeed like bees, like ants. The residents crowded inside, with the vast majority of nest capital inhabitants possibly never having seen sunlight in their lives. They lived within the honeycomb, toiling away to earn just enough corpse starch and water for sustenance. Some of them didn't even have jobs, as local demand and productivity could not provide enough employment opportunities. Those better off joined gangs, stayed warm in numbers, and survived by engaging in dirty or illegal work or exploiting others. Some became unemployed vagrants who relied on minimal government relief, worked odd jobs, and managed to not starve to death, striving to live and hoping to be chosen one day as part of the imperial tax, to be handed over. And it was precisely for this purpose that the Karolia government provided relief. A populace taxed at 5 tax currency per person. On a strict sustenance diet, where starvation is all that is avoided, 5 tax currency could support one person for 50 years. Of course, under conditions where only 0.1 tax currency is spent per year, most humans wouldn't live so long. Long-term malnutrition, diseases, adverse social conditions, accidents, they could all easily end a life. But what did it matter? As long as the poorest were kept from starving for the moment and were then used to pay taxes, that was enough. The main industry of Karolia, the driving force behind their tax contributions, was its population. They could indeed raise people like pigs even easier than livestock. After all, pigs can't work, but humans can be exploited in factories as child laborers after a few years of age, not to mention the adults. Salt City was such a place. But this city wasn't devoid of beauty. At the very top, the upper class lived in drunken luxury. A massive glass dome-filtered layer allowed the sunlight, which seeped through the damaged atmospheric layer, not only to avoid being lethal but to become warm and comfortable. The fierce storms carrying dust were filtered into easy breezes, the lit aromatic diffusers carried fragrance throughout the entire upper district. Except for the severe scarcity of water that made it difficult to grow many green plants, it was like a garden. And a grand banquet was held here. Gu Hang stood at the open-air Parliament Hall, gazing at the large and mild star in the sky, which he had been watching for a long time. Next to him, his mother was speaking with Pei Desi. In Gu Hang's recollection, Pei Desi was always impeccably dressed, meticulous, proper, reserved, and composed, with an inherent aura of dignified nobility. But today, even though his attire was still meticulous, the redness of his eyes was hard to conceal, as was the slight raspiness in his voice. Pei Desi asked, "You're really going to sell the ships?" "Yes," Wang Qi said with a wry smile, "otherwise, how would we satisfy the insatiable appetite of his apostleship of war?" Chapter 501. We shouldn't let him do whatever he wants, he sees us all as sheep to be slaughtered. Yeah, I agree. Why not have leader Pei Desi take the lead? Sigh. Pei Desi heaved a deep sigh. The two chatted for a few more words, and then the star sector leader excused himself and left to talk with others. It was only then that Gu Hang came back to his senses and said, "It seems that the news we put out about selling ships to raise money and cave in is credible enough, at least Pei Desi believes it." Wang Qi took a sip of her drink and gently patted her son next to her. "We were indeed going to sell the ships, to raise money. There's no benefit in clashing with Galleraldo, only disadvantages." Gu Hang, however, didn't elaborate any further. He hadn't told his mother his plan. In fact, he hadn't told anyone. This matter had to be kept completely secret. It wasn't that he didn't trust others, it's just that there were too many ways to obtain certain information in this universe. He had only told Wang Qi that he didn't plan to submit as Galleraldo wished. At most, he would release some false information about submission to alleviate some of the pressure, hoping to delay things until Galleraldo had had his fill elsewhere in the Tianma star sector and left. After all, the man didn't have time to linger in one star sector for too long. But clearly, Wang Qi had a different idea. She sighed and said, "Galleraldo will indeed leave soon, but, just because he leaves, doesn't mean he's gone. He wants to continue to maintain his deterrent power, so he will not let go of any person who defies him. As long as his power remains, even if he leaves, he has countless ways to target us. Even leader Paydesi has to submit. What can we do? 3 billion, if we have to give, we give. As she spoke the last sentence, she seemed to grit her teeth, clearly in pain. Gu Heng absent-mindedly nodded his head, then suddenly his eyes focused, locking onto the man emerging from backstage, grinning broadly. Not just Gu Heng, everyone's attention was drawn by his entrance. Was this his charm? This was the charm of power. He stood at the very center of the stage, picked up the microphone, cleared his throat twice, his smile gradually receding, turning to solemn and serious. When the entire room fell silent, he said, "We are facing a catastrophe. This disaster is not just happening on Karolia, not just on Rage Owl Star, but everywhere in the Empire. Glorious and great humanity, struggling to survive in the vast universe for countless years. Our species, with the blood of countless heroes and with absolute fearlessness and great sacrifice, has built our empire under the guidance of the Divine Emperor, securing a place for us in this dark and fearful universe. But danger has never been far away. Abyss demons, chaos traitors, aliens, smart mechanism automatons, have always threatened our existence. The Great Sun Lord has launched the largest expedition since the Emperor established the Empire. The stars and the sea submit under the Sun Lord's brilliance. This is a magnificent era, the territory of our empire expands day by day, countless worlds sunk in darkness are brought back into the embrace of the Empire, bathing in the Divine Emperor's light. I deeply feel the sacrifice of every imperial citizen for this cause. It's arduous, but glorious. Leader Paydesi and Governor Akuna have set an outstanding example. I believe under their leadership, Karolia will surely overcome those chaos traitors, letting the brilliant sunshine once again fill every corner of this world." Listening to this, Gu Heng knew that leader Paydesi and the Karolia Governor Ramalo Akuna had indeed submitted. Galaraldo had chosen the praising speech from the 2 drafts he had prepared. But for Gu Heng, none of this mattered anymore. He looked up at the sun once more. A rather inconspicuous shadow suddenly appeared. A hint of a smile formed on his lips. Finally, it had come. It was a dragon. Chapter 502. That was a dragon. Although it seemed small from afar, it was in fact an enormous creature. Its form, rapidly descending, became incredibly huge in a very short amount of time. Soon, it wasn't just Gu Heng who noticed it. People saw the appearance of the giant beast. It resembled the dragons from mythological legends, but it was far more terrifying. Its yellow-green body was covered in swellings, its rotting skin was pulsating, swarms of flies buzzed around it, those pallid, bloodless eyes, devoid of pupils, bulged out as if they would fall out at any moment. People were dumbstruck. Someone shouted out the name of the monster. "It's a rotting demon dragon. Divine Emperor above. Why has this thing appeared? Where is Minjian City's air defense firepower? The Void Shield?" In their panic, people became incredibly frazzled because of the arrival of this demon. Even the well-informed Galaraldo was looking solemn at this moment. The rotting demon dragon was an exceedingly difficult adversary, even when encountered during the expedition to the sun. This was a type of enormous dragon-shaped demon engine. Unlike the purgatory demon dragon that was forged from steel and hellfire, the rotting demon dragon seemed to be born from some sort of supernatural evil magic biotechnology, creating terrifying putrid flesh and binding a demon's soul within it. It had all the characteristics of dragons that people had fantasized about, characteristics that indeed had existed on some planets, and it was deeply melded with the concept of rot, thus forming the terrifying appearance seen now. Its strength could overturn a titan, and it had the ability to fly. A single breath of its corrupt exhale could turn steel, through supernatural evil magic, into writhing, rotten flesh. This was an extremely terrifying abyssal creature. The conditions for its emergence were supposed to be stringent. Although it had not reached the status of a great demon, its very existence was strongly repelled by the real world. Only when the real world had been eroded to some extent by abyssal laws could this monster be provided with the foundation to exist in the real dimension. True, there were many chaotic evildoers on Karolia 3, almost causing a nest capital to fall, but after all, the problem was still confined to one area and had not fully erupted to spread across the entire planet. If this powerful abyssal demon had appeared in that fallen nest capital, it would have been somewhat understandable. But in Minjian City? Why? The well-informed Galaraldo also found it unbelievable. But what appeared before his eyes was certainly not fake. Furthermore, this rotting demon dragon not only appeared, but it also somehow bypassed the city's air defense detection without raising an alarm and inexplicably penetrated the immense energy barrier, appearing on the inside of the defense shield. In an instant, Gallardo already harbored a suspicion: this was very likely a conspiracy aimed at him. Something, or someone, had let this demon dragon in. Otherwise, how could those chaotic evildoers find just the right time, when all the elite powers of the Tianma Star sector and even he, the War Apostle, were present, to launch an aerial assault? This was a conspiracy. He hadn't figured out how the one wielding this conspiratorial stratagem had managed it. But now, looking for reasons was meaningless, that was something to think about afterward. The primary issue was first to survive. The rotting demon dragon's pair of pale, dead eyes stared down below. Its massive maw was wide open. Gallardo had seen this scene before, but that time, he was watching from a distance, witnessing the Imperial army being bombarded by the dragon's aerial attack. Now, the corrupt exhale was aimed at him. Without a doubt, this blast of demon dragon breath would cause the majority of people at this outdoor banquet to die. With no other choice, the War Apostle brought out his skills. From the tip of the Sky Eagle scepter in his hand emanated a golden radiance. His eyes, too, shifted from their normal state to a pure golden color. The next moment, he outpaced the dragon's breath and unleashed 3 beams of golden sun rays from his eyes and scepter, directly striking the demon dragon. The rotting demon dragon was surrounded by a swarm of gathering filth flies. These deep filth flies, while minuscule compared to the dragon, were actually over a meter in diameter each. These giant flies formed a defensive line around the dragon. As the beams penetrated them, the explosion of dark magic contaminated them, reducing their might. Eventually, although the beams still hit the rotting demon dragon, they merely burned 3 unmistakable large holes into its massive body. This damage made the dragon howl but also fueled its anger. The dense, corrupt breath was still, inevitably, descending from the sky. Gallardo had confidence that he would survive such an onslaught. Although he was not a practitioner of spiritual energy nor did he possess the absurdly robust physique of top warriors, the blessings shared from the Sun Lord, the divine power of the Emperor, would protect him, rendering him immune to all evil and granting him tenacious life. But there was no doubt that the many dignitaries here would suffer heavy casualties. For instance, he glanced at the crowd of people beside him, noting the solemn Gu Hang and Wang Qi, who had a look of horror on her face. Chapter 503. He had heard that the Gu family was already discussing selling their ship, bowing down to him, and making the 3 billion tax currency donation. But if they died here today, who would pay the 3 billion? And it wasn't just them. Figures like the head of some star sector, Paydesi, Karolia Governor Akuna, and many other nobles who had already agreed to pay more or less. If they died, all the money that had been negotiated would be gone. What should he do? As he pondered, his expression suddenly became fixed, and he saw Gu Hang making a move within his field of vision. His eyes turned deep blue, and with a push of his hands upward, a deep blue shield formed over the open-air banquet hall. The corrupt breath hit right against this deep blue light screen. Gallardo was once again taken aback. He had looked through Gu Hang's file, which mentioned that the governor of Rage Owl Star was a psychic, a lawful one, registered with the Psychic Cultivators Association. But at first, he didn't take this piece of information seriously. In the Empire, many powerful families, if their descendants had a certain psychic talent, liked to cultivate it occasionally. After all, if the opportunity arose, who wouldn't want to wield some extraordinary power? However, most of the time, it was a blind investment, mastering some tricks, and being able to move a cup without touching it was pretty much it. Yet, the power Mr. Gu exhibited far exceeded the normal level. By his judgment, to withstand the decay dragon's breath, one would have to be a very powerful psychic, at least an A-level psychic according to the ratings of the Psychic Cultivators Association. Such psychics, even within the Solar Expedition Army, were rare talents. Their value even surpassed that of a starship. He had misjudged. Had Gu Hang actually possessed such powerful psychic talent? What was the Psychic Cultivators Association in the Tianma Star sector doing, to have failed to gather even this information? By this time, Gallardo could finally relax a bit. With the presence of Gu Hang, an A-level psychic, the casualties would be greatly reduced. Thank heavens! This commotion wasn't only noticed by Gallardo, everyone present saw it too. The nobles thought they were certainly going to die, but then a savior descended from heaven. Gu Hang's voice echoed throughout the banquet hall, Everyone please evacuate quickly. Leave the open area. Head to the lower levels. I can't hold on for long. Awakened as if from a dream, the crowd began to retreat hastily. Wang Qi stood next to Gu Hang, filled with shock and worry. Gu Hang's voice rang out in her mind alone, telling her to leave. She clenched her teeth and turned to leave. Regardless of her worries, she knew that in an event like today's, she would be of no use, staying would only burden Gu Hang. Under the protection of her bodyguards, she began to evacuate with the other nobles, under the protection of the psychic light shield, as the plague dragon, frantic and frustrated, unleashed its corrupt breath again and again. The other nobles ran as if their lives depended on it. After all, no one was sure how long Gu Hang could hold on. If one ran too slowly, and Gu Hang failed to block the breath, once it hit the ground, death was certain. But running away wasn't so easy either. Outside the banquet hall, there was a cacophony of gunfire. Some plague undead and other monsters carrying the plague appeared around the banquet hall. They had very strong resistance to bullets, unless their bodies were completely shredded by gunfire, they could not be killed. The guards had already engaged these monsters, but they failed to eliminate them immediately. Instead, the chaos allowed some of the creatures to break into the hall. The hideously disgusting appearance of these chaotic plague monsters provoked a wave of screams and cries. Just as these plague monsters were about to wreak havoc among the crowd, streak after streak of golden light flashed, accurately picking off one monster after another. Gallaraldo made his move. His rather majestic voice rang out, "Don't panic. Evacuate in an orderly fashion." This voice seemed to carry a certain calming psychological effect and indeed prevented the situation from further deteriorating. Meanwhile, the long-absent air defense firepower of Minjian City finally awoke from its slumber and opened fire. However, the initially insufficient number of active air defenses seemed rather sparse. The swarms of filth flies around took most of the firepower, with only a fraction hitting the rotting demon dragon. Objectively speaking, although the air defense seemed weak at the moment, after all, the rotting demon dragon was a lone dragon in the pond, with no accompanying demon air forces and insufficient ground support. As layers of the filth flies were peeled away by the anti-aircraft guns, the number of operational air defenses would increase with time. Not to mention, Minjian City's highest tier of combat power had also reacted by now. Many flying motorcycles shot up into the air. Battle nuns clad in green and white powered armor surged into the sky. They circled the demon dragon, their bomb guns firing continuously. The most eye-catching and dashing among them was a short-haired lady wielding a huge long-handled battle saber. With the reinforcement of anti-air fire and the battle nuns from the Order of Merciful Lilies joining the fight, the demon dragon was unlikely to withstand and was doomed to fall. Many people could see this. Gallaraldo thought to himself that whoever orchestrated this attack had now essentially failed. Even he had not expected an A-grade psychic cultivator like Gu Hang to be present in the banquet hall, let alone those conspirators. Even with good intelligence sources, he only knew that Gu Hang had gone through psychic training since his youth. He had learned from the battle nuns that Gu Hang had a certain level of psychic combat ability. However, his intelligence analysts had estimated Gu Hang's psychic strength to be only D grade, at most C grade. Who could have imagined that a planetary governor could exhibit such a level of combat power? The kid had kept a really deep cover. But this was good news. While firing golden beams and eliminating monsters that had entered the banquet hall, Gallaraldo's thoughts were already turning to how he could use this incident afterward, how to find this possible conspirator who could use the abyss demons to set up the plot. He was thinking when suddenly a phantom fissure opened up right above his head. His reflexes were extremely fast, and he immediately rotated his staff to strike upwards. Several plague demons that fell from the crack were killed on impact. However, that abyssal fissure expanded rapidly in a short amount of time. The plague demons poured down like rain, and the golden light beams simply couldn't eliminate so many. He was overwhelmed by countless abyss demons. Despite this, he felt only a heavy heart and not too much panic. Golden light enveloped him as he kept killing the approaching demons. As long as he protected himself well, he believed his guards and other human warriors would definitely come to his rescue. And that was indeed the case. He detected Gu Hang's psychic power coming to his aid immediately. Many abyss demons surrounding him were swept away and crushed by the psychic energy. Mere tricks, he scoffed internally. But in the next moment, he suddenly felt a terrifying pulling force. Another abyssal fissure appeared right beneath his feet. He tried his best to resist, but he was still unable to prevent himself from falling into the crack. Moments later, the plague demons that had surrounded his previous position were wiped clean by Gu Hang's psychic power, and the fissure in mid-air gradually shrank, with no new demons falling through. However, the figure of the war apostle was nowhere to be seen. Gu Hang looked tense as he used his psychic power to call for everyone to search for the war apostle's location. Elsewhere, the abyssal fissures closed quietly. Deprived of the power of the abyssal fissures, the remaining demons, including the demon dragon in the sky still exchanging blows with the battle nuns, would lose their source of power that allowed them to exist in the real world, and they would soon be driven back to the abyss. But no matter, Gu Hang had achieved his goal. Chapter 504. The attack in the banquet hall came swiftly, unexpectedly, and ended just as abruptly. The plague demons, along with the rotting dragons above, turned ethereal and weak within a short period of time, ultimately either annihilated or banished back to the abyssal hell. However, the survivors were still shaken to the core. With eyes closed, people could still recall the revolting sight of the plague demons and the fear they brought. Undoubtedly, the ordeal would leave an indelible psychological scar in the minds of many of the elite. Yet aside from that, an actual tally of the day's specifics would reveal that the casualties from this brief and unexpected demon attack were quite limited. Firstly, the duration was too short, and secondly, the most threatening rotting dragon, at the outset of the ambush, had its corrupt breath blocked by Gu Hang, savior of Tianma, with his powerful spiritual energy. This so-called savior of Tianma is a title that came about who knows how after the incident and rapidly became popular. Beyond leaving a deep psychological shadow on the attendees, that banquet also left the memory of Gu Hang's heroic figure. Who would have thought that there could be such a heroic figure in the Tianma Star sector? After the incident, the stream of visitors wanting to thank Gu Hang was endless, but they were all refused entry. The official explanation was that Gu Hang had suffered severe mental trauma while combating the rotting dragon and needed time to rest, making it inconvenient to receive visitors. Of course, Gu Hang did meet with some people, such as head figures like Pei Desi, sparing some time to see them with his mother. Their arrival, however, was not just for the simple purpose of expressing thanks. The main concern was about Galleraldo. The loss of life in the banquet hall was minimal, but the most exalted war apostle had gone missing. Right before everyone's eyes, he was completely engulfed by the plague demons. Even though the hero Gu Hang immediately reached out to help, eliminating the demons surrounding the war apostle, there was no sign of the apostle there anymore. This was a grave matter. As soon as the attack was over and the abyssal demons had been exterminated or banished, related personnel immediately launched an all-out search. Mortal soldiers mobilized everywhere under the direction of various officials. By now, the search had extended even to the middle and lower districts of Minjian City. Many knew that such actions were futile. Galleraldo had vanished in full view, what could they find by running to the lower districts? Not to mention, Minjian City is a vast nest capital of 3 billion people. The upper and middle districts still maintain some order, but in the lower districts, the government's control is so weak it's practically impossible to search. However, this isn't a question of ability or fact, but rather a matter of attitude. If you lose someone and then don't search for them, isn't that unacceptable? That's definitely unthinkable. Even knowing it's unlikely to find anything, you still have to invest a lot of manpower and resources in the search, praying for a miracle, and more importantly, hoping to bear less of the blame when it's time for accountability. The real work was being carried out by the church forces, especially the battle nuns of St. Lily. They didn't waste time on fruitless efforts, but instead conducted their investigation right at the epicenter where the incident had erupted and where the plague demons had appeared in the greatest numbers. The investigation concerned supernatural forces. The priests of the church, the nuns of St. Lily, now had several theories but had hit a bottleneck in their investigation. They urgently needed the help of a powerful spiritual energy user to confirm which of their theories, if any, were correct. And while there were spiritual energy users on Corolia 3, the local Psychic Cultivators Association was simply too subpar. The strongest among them were a few sea-level spiritual energy users, who bragged around normally, even being called Grand Wizards. In fact, the construction of the Psychic Cultivators Association throughout the entire Dragonhawk star domain was deficient. The Tianma star sector was still among the better ones. These fellows were also called out to join the investigation, but clearly, they were not much help. The sea-level spiritual energy users were, at best, around the initial level 4 of spiritual energy that Gu Hang once had. There was no choice but to turn to Gu Hang. Upon consideration, Gu Hang agreed to go and see what they had uncovered. Although Gu Hang didn't believe they would discover anything significant, After inviting Gu Hang, Pei Desi and A Kuna did not leave but started making small talk with Miss Wang Qi in front of Gu Hang, seemingly in no hurry to press Gu Hang into work. Gu Hang, pale and appearing gravely injured, overheard and understood perfectly what these two significant figures of the Tianma Star sector were thinking. Beyond any potential instigators or perpetrators, the two of them were ultimately responsible for this incident. As for the perpetrator, well, that goes without saying. For Pei Desi and A Kuna, the disappearance of a person within their jurisdiction was the gravest of offences. It was obviously unrealistic to expect the person in charge of security at the banquet hall to take the fall. That was just some small fry who couldn't withstand the Empire's fury. In fact, neither could they. They would certainly be held accountable, and the charges could be extremely severe. They were both aware of this, yet they could not just sit back and await their doom. Chapter 505. The best way to lessen the blame was, of course, to find the missing war apostle. But that was quite unrealistic. According to the national religion, the Saintless Nun Association, and the Psychic Cultivators Association, based on the investigations of the past 2 days, they had calculated many possibilities, but almost none were good news. Although they still held a sliver of hope and were searching, they also needed to think of other methods. Gu Hang was the method they had come up with. It was not easy to talk to the battle nuns. These daughters of the Emperor had always followed their own rules. Both the national religion and the Psychic Cultivators Association had been approached, and the reports they would issue subsequently would favor the leadership and Governor A Kuna, trying to remove some of the blame from them. They still didn't feel secure, and now they had approached Gu Hang. The implication was rather straightforward. Gu Hang had already shown great spiritual energy, and his words undoubtedly carried more weight. After considering it, he expressed his intentions. He would help out after he joined the investigation in a couple of days, depending on the situation at the scene. The two high-ranking officials thanked him profusely in low voices and didn't stay much longer before they left. Despite getting what they wanted, their faces still could not be considered relaxed. The situation was still very bleak. While Gu Hang felt sympathy for the two men, he had no intention of truly helping them. What use was mitigating blame? If 100% blame would get them killed, they already had at least 200%. What use would it be if Gu Hang helped to reduce it by 15 or 20%? The Empire was never reasonable in this respect. Moreover, Gu Hang himself needed someone to take the fall. After seeing off the two officials, and telling his mother that he needed to rest, he gained some space to be alone. The area around his temporarily living quarters had been set up with a spiritual energy barrier, ensuring that nothing he did inside would be detected by the outside world. He first checked the barrier and found no problems, then he sat cross-legged on the carpet and closed his eyes. The next moment, his consciousness descended into the Storm God Kingdom. Here, a war was underway. Countless heroic spirit warriors were fighting to the death against plague demons. This battle had been going on for several days. At first, the number of plague demons appeared overwhelming, swarming in. But by now, they had been thoroughly annihilated. The cost was not small. More than 3,000 spirits living within the Storm God Kingdom had been sacrificed. Their souls had been torn apart under the abyssal evil magic, and even Gu Hang did not have the power to summon them back. This was a significant loss. There weren't many heroic spirits to begin with. The original batch came from the souls of human soldiers who had sacrificed themselves in the divine realm during the battle against the primordial rage owl god. Thereafter, every soldier who had been trained through Gu Hang's soldier tag system and who had died in battle also came here. At its peak, there were over 30,000 heroic spirits in the divine realm. Most of them were from the casualties of the Hagian Star battle and the Western Front on Rage Owl Star, with a very few from the Green Valley Group army who had been combating the aberrant beasts in the jungle. The loss of 3,000 heroic spirits meant a 10% reduction in their numbers. And these heroic spirits, in essence apart from being the souls of the warriors, were also the incarnations of the power of the Storm God Kingdom. Unlike the storm beasts casually created by the primordial rage owl, each of these heroic spirits possessed much greater strength, each sharing a part of the storm divine power. Such immense sacrifice also significantly drained the Storm God Kingdom itself. But this was the price that Gu Hang had to pay. There was no other way. The plague demon attack that took place in the upper district of Minjian City was orchestrated by him alone. After receiving the banquet invitation from Galaraldo, Gu Hang planned to make his move. As long as the incident didn't unfold on Rage Owl Star, he was confident it would go unnoticed by gods and ghosts alike. The means he used, of course, hinged on the storm god kingdom he controlled. With the essence of a subspace inferior god in his hands, this was the best opportunity to use it. His original plan was simply to employ the characteristics of the divine realm to open a subspace rift and drag Galraldo into the storm god kingdom. Just pulling a soul in, just as the Alliance's forces were dragged into the storm god kingdom during their attack on Extreme North Industrial City. If successful, Gu Heng could have killed the man without anyone the wiser. However, upon arriving at Karolia 3, Gu Heng discovered an even better method. The situation on Karolia 3 was more severe than he had imagined, far worse than the south of Rage Owl Star when it was invaded by demons a year prior. Despite the emergence of great demon incarnations within the sea platforms to the south of Green Valley at that time, essentially, that was an overzealous attempt by the Great Unclean One. In terms of scale, the cult had exhausted great effort to open a mere abyssal rift through the energy of a still functional spiritualized gas field on the sea platform. But on Karolia 3, such abyssal rifts were innumerable. If Gu Heng were merely a top-tier psychic, his perception might not be so clear. But as he also controlled the source power of a subspace inferior god, the bonus this added was substantial. The interior of Karolia 3 was riddled with holes, ravaged beyond recognition. It was unclear how long the cultists had been working in the shadows on this planet with a population of 40 billion, using dark magic and sacrifices, infecting countless people, thinning the veil between the planet and the subspace abyss to its breaking point. Here, tearing open an abyssal rift was quite easy. From within the Storm God Kingdom, the conquered Nest capital already had countless such rifts. Moreover, the current invasion of Karolia 3 was likely backed by the forces under the Chaos Lord known as the Benevolent Father. This was the crisis facing Karolia 3. According to Gu Heng's assessment, the crisis facing the planet was already significant. Yet in reality, it was merely the beginning. The forthcoming disasters would likely sweep across the globe, engulfing every Nest capital. One wrong move, and the catastrophe that 40 billion people would endure might be colossal. If such a scenario unfolded and Karolia 3 fell, the entire Tianma star sector would be doomed. The souls of 40 billion humans, amidst the suffering and despair of the plague, would completely open a colossal abyssal rift, dragging the entire planet into the subspace. From this vast, planet-sized black hole, legions of chaos would swarm out, with demon fleets carrying the chaos armies to slaughter those in the surrounding area. This was the crisis that could destroy the entire star sector. Of course, Gu Heng was vigilant about this, with his Rage Owl star being just next to Karolia 3, a mere star realm tunnel jump away. Should the worst occur, if Karolia fell first, Rage Owl star would be the next to go. But the crisis on Karolia could wait. Its present massive invasion by the Benevolent Father's domain presented Gu Heng with an excellent opportunity to deal with Galraldo. What he had to do was not difficult. First, he had to tear open a rift from the divine realm to the Father's domain within his Storm God Kingdom, a remarkably simple task. Subspace, while not the same as the real universe, still had myriad connections to it. When Gu Heng arrived at Karolia 3, close to the Benevolent Father's domain, his Storm God Kingdom also neared the Father's domain. Of course, he wasn't seen as an enemy by the Benevolent Father like an ant wandering near a giant, unnoticed, disregarded even if seen. After opening the rift and allowing a fair share of plague demons to rush in, he then had to create one or more rifts in the real world, right above the banquet hall and the surrounding area, and connect them together. That would amount to a corridor from the real world directly into the Father's domain of the abyss. The rotting dragon and the plague demons that emerged from the ground all arrived in that manner. Chapter 506. Actually, Gu Heng's original plan was somewhat risky. Directly pulling Galraldo's soul into the Storm God Kingdom, if everything went smoothly and was completed in a second, there wouldn't be any problem, but if this guy had any special preparations, any interruption during the pulling would leave traces. Though Gu Heng would definitely disguise any traces left behind, and it would take a long time for the Empire's official investigation team to arrive, any remnants of subspace energy would eventually dissipate completely. As for Karolia III's local capabilities, let's not even mention the Psychic Cultivators Association, hopelessly amateur. There is no direct dispatch organization from the tribunal in the Tianma Star sector, so no worries there. It's just that the nuns of the Holy Lilies are a bit troublesome, particularly since many of them have spent time in the Rage Owl Star, even directly joining the crackdown on the Storm cult. These nuns have a probability of seeing through Gu Heng's disguises and realizing that it originates from the subspace evil god on Rage Owl Star that should have been destroyed. In this case, Gu Heng, being the only one present from Rage Owl Star, would see his level of suspicion skyrocket. However, with the help of the plague demons, there would be no such concerns. For Gu Heng, the best outcome would be for the plague demons to emerge and directly slaughter Galaraldo. An apostle of war dying at the hands of demons emerging from an abyssal rift that had opened in a world corroded by demons would be considered an accident, perhaps with a hint of conspiracy, but no matter how much they investigated, they should not, and would not be able to trace it back to Gu Heng. Yes, he is an A-level psychic, but even the most powerful S-level, let alone the legendary Alpha-level psychics who can tear apart a planet, are not known to be able to manually and out of nothing open an abyssal rift that's just not within the psychic's range of abilities. Gu Heng was able to do it because he borrowed the essence of a subspace inferior god. This point, too, Gu Heng could freely allow others to investigate, for without revealing anything, they would find nothing. Moreover, in this demonic attack, he came forward and saved so many people. Before Galaraldo's disappearance, it was he who had made a valiant attempt at rescue, all events that took place in full view of the public. The reason Gu Heng did this was, on one hand, not wanting to drag too many people into it, having the upper echelons of the Tianma Star sector caught in one swoop would cause chaos throughout the whole sector. On the other hand, he was also trying to wash away any suspicion from himself. As for revealing his psychic level, that was bound to be exposed anyway. Once the Empire investigated everyone present at the time, Gu Heng's powerful psychic abilities could not possibly remain concealed. As long as they couldn't find out about the subspace inferior god, that was enough. But unfortunately, Gu Heng had already overestimated Galaraldo's capabilities, yet he didn't expect that this guy was pretty tough. Even with so many demons appearing, he couldn't be killed. In the end, Gu Heng still took action, deliberately opening a subspace rift beneath the other's feet, not bothering with the soul pulling anymore, directly sending the entire person into it. And, to avoid any loopholes, Gu Heng didn't even pull the guy into the Storm God Kingdom, but maintained the connection between the Divine Realm and the Father's domain, directly delivering the man into the Father's domain. With that, things were truly foolproof. Even if you ask Galaraldo himself, he wouldn't know it was Gu Heng who had acted, only knowing he was attacked by plague demons and pulled into a subspace filled with deadly poison, pestilence, and despair, matching exactly the feel of the demons that attacked him. And Gu Heng? Wasn't he the one who gave me a big hand and tried to save me in the end, alas in vain? Of course, Gu Heng didn't believe that the Apostle of War had any chance to tell all this himself, which was somewhat regrettable. Thinking this, Gu Heng, who had ascended in consciousness to the Divine Realm, closed his eyes and began to use his psychic sensing abilities to search for the target. When he took Galaraldo away, Gu Heng had deliberately left a mark on him. It had no other use, except to let him sense and track the specific condition of the target. It was a way to confirm for sure that the guy was indeed dead. However, what surprised him a bit was that Galaraldo was still not dead. That guy really had an extraordinary life force. How long had it been since he was thrown into the Father's domain? Almost 2 days now. Not to die in all this time was somewhat shocking. Gu Heng asked himself, if it had been him in the same situation, setting aside the special circumstance of controlling the origin of the subspace inferior god, and merely relying on psychic powers, perhaps 2 days would be approaching the limit as well. Though he had never experienced it firsthand, one in the Father's domain as a human would indeed be in agonizing torment. Not to mention the constant attacks from plague demons, the mere environment was enough to corrode a person into an eternally undying mass of rotten flesh, yet full of indescribable pain. This is the Father. It seems to love all creatures including the parasites, viruses, bacteria, and cancer cells in the human body. In Gu Heng's perception, a dazzling golden light was protecting Galaraldo. It was a blessing from the Emperor. In the real world, the power of the Emperor's blessing was roughly equivalent to that of an A-level psychic. But in subspace, although one was in the Father's domain, the essence was closer to the Divine Emperor's spirit network. With the strengthening bond, the blessing granted by the Divine Emperor also became more potent. Chapter 507. This was the core reason Galaraldo could persist for such a long time. But there was a limit. He had merely received the Divine Emperor's blessing, he was not the Divine Emperor himself who had to keep him alive. Gu Heng didn't believe he could survive for long while staying in the abyssal hell filled with malice. Withdrawing his attention from him, Gu Heng checked on the status of his Storm God Kingdom. Previously, to tear open the abyssal rift, Gu Heng had used the Storm God Kingdom as a passage connecting the real world and the abyssal hell. This indeed allowed a large number of plague demons to directly descend upon Galaraldo's head, but the Storm God Kingdom was also invaded by the plague demons. Those plague demons were not Gu Heng's subordinates, nor would they listen to his orders. To exterminate these demons, the heroic spirit warriors of the Storm God Kingdom had paid a significant price. The casualties and consumption were substantial, there was no doubt about it, but it was not without gains. Firstly, this was a tally at the end of the battle. Storm God Kingdom Battle Tally. Bloody victory, earned 884 blessing points. Loss of 3,121, extermination of 4,152. Among the invading plague demons, although there were many relatively low-level monsters such as plague corpses, plague wraiths, and plague giant flies, there were also powerful beings like plague carriers. Not to mention, the rot dragon that was expelled also lingered in the Storm God Kingdom. That dragon was strong, even though it had taken many hits from the anti-aircraft guns above Minjian City, had lost many plague flies that protected it, and had suffered numerous wounds due to the golden beam from Galaraldo and the battle nuns who subsequently rode flying motorcycles to the sky and attacked it with bomb guns and sharp blades. But it was still formidable. Merely to exterminate it, Gu Hang's heroic spirit warriors had lost at least 600 lives. However, although the average individual strength of the enemy was solid, since the overall scale of the battle wasn't too large, and considering the considerable losses on Gu Hang's side, the rating was only a bloody victory, resulting in a not-so-high reward coefficient. In this way, the total yielded blessing points was about 800 or so. For Gu Hang at that time, the system's level of expenditure was very high, and his monthly fixed income of blessing points had already exceeded 3,000, hence, he didn't value the additional 800 blessing points very much. However, the benefits of exterminating so many demons within the Storm God Kingdom were not limited to blessing points alone. After these demons were killed, their subspace origin would remain here. And these things were the nourishment of the Storm God Kingdom. Even though the corpses left here turned into a pile of pus, quite disgusting to behold, in reality, with some time and purification of the contamination, the remnants could be digested, thereby enhancing the depth and breadth of the entire divine realm. To kill and devour other abyssal demons was akin to seizing the power of other evil gods. Of course, for that great father, it was as insignificant as a drop of water in the ocean, completely undetectable. For a while, Gu Hang even thought of trying this approach again, casually opening a passage between the Storm God Kingdom and the domains of other subspace evil gods, especially when Gu Hang himself was on Karolia 3, particularly close to the father's domain. Lure the demons in to kill them, after their deaths, earn blessing points and digest their subspace origin energy to strengthen his own divine realm. But he quickly discarded this suicidal thought. Indeed, killing a few thousand or tens of thousands of ordinary demons was absolutely inconsequential for the father, no cause for concern. But accidents happen when they are least expected. If by chance the father's gaze happened to fall here, that would be the end of it. Being in subspace, without the avail of reality that the more powerful the demon, the harder it is to break through, there would be nowhere to run. Not to mention attracting the father's gaze, even if just a great demon or a great unclean one were to come, that would be enough to cause Gu Hang serious trouble. Even though Gu Hang's personal strength was respectable, even with the divine realm's enhancement and being able to desperately fight a great demon in a home field environment, that was when the real trouble would begin. Immediately thereafter, a second, third, even 7 or 8 great unclean ones might turn up, and that would indeed be normal. Such suicidal actions were better left undone. After resting for a day, Gu Hang returned to the scene of the incident. Here, it almost remained as it was at the time, without any cleanup or organization. The security guarded the place tightly. At the scene, the battle nun, the psychic cultivator assembly representative, a bishop from the state religion, and a technical priest from the mechanical cult guild were already waiting. The leader, of course, was the head of the nuns at this place, Sister Chong Ji Ruot, as well as Bishop Zhao Qinghong from the state religion. However, after Gu Hang's arrival, the most enthusiastic was the psychic cultivator assembly representative. His name was Wang Yuyang, the person in charge of the Tianma Star Sector Psychic Association, usually based on Flying Wing Star, with the headquarters of the Tianma Star Sector Psychic Association located there as well. He had also been invited by Galaraldo to Karolia 3 to attend the banquet on behalf of the Psychic Association. Generally, on Flying Wing Star he was always referred to with great esteem as Grand Mage, and indeed, his status was very high. Wang Yuyang was extremely warm and solicitous, skirting around the real issue concerning the investigation, instead continually introducing the status of the Tianma Star Sector Psychic Association. Chapter 508. Gu Hang wasn't at all embarrassed. If you want to talk, I'll keep you company. In the process of their conversation, he began to understand the reason behind Wang Yuyang's attitude. The Psychic Cultivators Association was a major organization within the empire that managed spiritual energy practitioners and held a non-fixed seat in the Imperial Supreme Council, highlighting its significance. However, unlike the state religion and the Mechanical Cult Guild, two powerful religious organizations, the Psychic Cultivators Association resembled more a scholarly organization. Its structure was relatively loose, the control of the upper echelons over the lower ranks was weak, and it neither had fixed territories like the sanctuary world of the state religion and the foundry world of the Mechanical Cult Guild, nor did it have its own military forces like the Battle Nun Association and the Mechanical Protective Forces. It had three main institutions under its jurisdiction: the Star Language Hall, Star Guidance Hall, and Star Law Hall. The Star Language Hall was responsible for training those who could build and maintain the Star Language Towers. The Star Guidance Hall was responsible for training navigators who guide starships through the Star Realm Tunnel. The Star Law Hall trained combat spiritual energy practitioners for the Imperial Navy and Army. In the Tianma Star Sector, however, there was no such detailed division, just a dispatched institution of the Psychic Cultivators Association, and that was it. Mainly because it's too weak. But did Wang Yuyang think that way? He didn't. But with limited capabilities, what could he, a C-level spiritual energy practitioner, do? Over the years, he took on many students, but not many could break through to D-level. Most were at E-level, and it was already not bad if their combat skills allowed them to defeat armed infantry by a ratio of 7 to 3 unarmed. They definitely didn't hold much sway in discussions. However, Gu Hang's arrival gave him a tremendous hope. In the Psychic Cultivators Association, the words of 10,000 low-level practitioners weren't as effective as a single high-level one. He still remembered Gu Hang. Although not his student, as the scion of the Gu family, he had initially registered with the Psychic Cultivators Association on Flying Wing Star. All this ought to be considered a feat of the Tianma Psychic Cultivators Association. Reporting upwards that they had produced an A-level spiritual energy practitioner would instantly elevate his status greatly, and direct rewards could make him prosperous. However, the only thing was, Gu Hang needed to cooperate a little. After all, he hadn't truly cultivated Gu Hang, and if Gu Hang hadn't revealed his strength in a crisis, he would have been none the wiser. Gu Hang was quite moved by this as well. The Psychic Cultivators Association seemed like something he could make use of. Especially since the Tianma Star Sectors Association was still weak, he even came up with an idea: was it possible to relocate the headquarters of the Tianma Cultivators Association to Rage Owl Star? Even opening a branch would be fine. This could be tax deductible, strive for funding from the Psychic Cultivators Association, and gain access to more orthodox ways of training spiritual energy practitioners. Most importantly, Rage Owl Star already had unique conditions. Furthermore, Gu Hang already had plans to cultivate more spiritual energy practitioners. Introducing the Empire's official power would provide a good explanation for the large number of new spiritual energy practitioners. And while the two of them were enjoying their conversation, a soft cough came from the side. Sister Chang Ji Ruot, who was familiar with Gu Hang, walked up. "Excuse me for interrupting your conversation. However, we can talk about other matters later. For today, we need to deal with the current issue. Mr. Gu, we still need your help very much this time. I'm sorry for the trouble." Georgette's attitude towards Gu Hang was very respectful. For her, it was not the first time witnessing Mr. Gu's strength. They had worked well together during the eradication of cult members on Rage Owl Star. Gu Hang was nothing if not accommodating. "Okay, Master Wang, we can talk later. Let's take care of official business first." Chapter 509. While Mr. Gu was on Corollia 3, coordinating with a joint investigation team formed by personnel from various forces to investigate the disappearance case of the War Apostles, inside the Human Command Center on the Western Front at Rage Owl Star, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Yan Fangxiu tightly gripped the combat plan he and his comrades at the staff office had labored over for several days and nights, his face a picture of displeasure as he looked at the person sitting at the top. This person looked quite majestic and robust, a big, beard-dense bald man. His name was Cai Minjin, a major general of the Imperial Star Realm Army, commander of the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion 4th Corps, and the overall commander of the troops from the Fascist Star System, totaling 1 million soldiers, who came to Rage Owl Star to reinforce the battle. The initial 300,000 and the subsequent 700,000 troops on their way all belonged to this 4th Corps. They were all his direct subordinates. A total of 25 large brigades had been dispatched. He had arrived at Rage Owl Star with the vanguard of 300,000 soldiers. His decisiveness was undeniable. After the landing of 7 large brigades, amounting to 300,000 troops, he led his men to the western front and met with Yan Fangxiu right away. He knew that Yan Fangxiu was the highest commander of the so-called Rage Bear Legion in this area and also the commander of the planet's planetary defense force. Therefore, to quickly push forward the battle and resolve the problems on this planet, it was obvious that he had to approach this man. To put it bluntly, Cai Minjin didn't at all feel that this battle was worth wasting his time on. He was originally reluctant to come. The Iron Man rebellion sounded terrifying, but he heard that after the local planetary defense force on Rage Owl Star fought a battle with the so-called Iron Man rebel army, they achieved a significant victory with minimal casualties. Therefore, Cai Minjin believed that the enemy they were about to face was probably just so-so. Since the higher-ups arranged for him to come and fight, then he would fight. However, he didn't plan on wasting too much time here. As such, the moment General Cai Minjin arrived at the front line and summoned Yan Fangxiu, he set aside the so-called campaign plan without a glance and immediately proposed his own idea. I want to achieve significant results within 3 weeks. We have 3 weeks' time, during which our Corps' remaining forces should also be in place. Then, after gathering them, I expect to completely eliminate the rebels on your planet within 6 weeks. I want my soldiers to be able to return to Fatches 2 to celebrate the new year. Of course, Yan Fangxiu would not mind the Star Realm army wanting to end the battle quickly. Although he found General Cai to be somewhat arrogant, if it was just a matter of attitude, he could bear it. They came with a 1,000,000-strong army to help fight the war. No matter how arrogant their demeanor, it was acceptable. However, what Cai Minjin proposed next was something Yan Fangxiu could not accept. It was bad enough that Cai Minjin completely disregarded Yan Fangxiu's battle plan, but the new plan he put forward was utterly objectionable. He acted as if he were the supreme commander of the Allied forces. The Central Group Army of the Alliance, combined with half of the Rage Bear Legion, totaling 270,000 troops, had mostly recovered their positions from before the Flash Tail operation. Meanwhile, Cai Minjin's Star Realm army was essentially massed on the Central Boulevard. According to Cai Minjin's new operational concept, the Alliance's forces would launch a full-scale offensive in a few days. His 4th Corps would advance along the mainland, moving behind the Central Collection 1 Brigade. They would support the battlefields everywhere, ensuring that within 2 weeks, they would crush the enemies in front, break through the western desert, and penetrate westward into the mainland. In Yan Fangxiu's view, this was too reckless, too hasty. Do you know how many forces Blackbird Heavy Industries has regrouped in the month after the Flash Tail operation, and what is the distribution of these forces? Launching an all-out fierce attack without knowing anything? But that perspective was secondary. If Cai Minjin let his forces carry out such high-risk actions, Yan Fangxiu would at most earnestly persuade him to reconsider. However, Cai Minjin clearly had a different intention. His 7 large brigades were not planning to engage on the front lines initially but to gather behind and provide support whenever needed. Wasn't this tantamount to sending the Alliance's troops into the largest, deepest traps? If they can get through, then they get through. If they can't, I will decide if I want to send reinforcement based on the situation. Using the forces of Rage Owl Star as cannon fodder? Where is the sense in that? But, in most cases, that's exactly how it is. To many, the Star Realm army is considered cannon fodder, which is a comparison to the Starfighter battle group, the Sisterhood, some elite forces, and the precious Imperial Navy fleet. But in reality, the so-called Hammer of the Empire, the Star Realm army, is the Empire's primary ground force. They are numerous, ferocious in firepower, fearless in sacrifice, and rely mainly on artillery and armor as their strength, crushing the enemies of the Empire like a steadfast warhammer. Indeed, they don't possess the glamour and flamboyance of some elite units, and in many cases, they serve as a background for the elites, becoming expendable material that can be consumed to create opportunities. But this does not negate their own achievements and value. Yet compared to others, the Star Realm army is still not at the very bottom of the Empire's military system. The Planetary Defense Force is. Chapter 510. Although it could not be said that the entire Planetary Defense Army was incompetent, there were indeed formidable units, but those were exceptions. Generally speaking, their combat effectiveness was far inferior to that of the Star Realm Army. Moreover, on battlefields where the Star Realm Army was needed for support, it meant that the planet was already in serious trouble and the local planetary defense forces had been unable to resolve the issue. In such cases, with their higher status, stronger strength, and the identity of saviors, the Star Realm army could easily become the more dominant party. Strictly speaking, there was no hierarchical relationship between the two forces. However, according to some military regulations of the Empire, the Star Realm army indeed had the right to take command of the local planetary forces when necessary. Although Yan Fangxiu also held a position as a commander in the Star Realm army, it was clear that the scale of the Rage Bear Legion, as well as Yan Fangxiu's rank of colonel, were far behind Cai Minjin, a bona fide imperial major general. When the other party was determined to seize command, Yan Fangxiu really had no good solution. If it wasn't for the need for the help of the Star Realm army, then it would be easier to handle, just ignore them. But if you really wanted to take control, then you would have to see if you could manage it. But the key issue was that they were actually asking for the Star Realm army's assistance, right? Yan Fangxiu had already tried to persuade the other side twice and even revised his battle plan multiple times. If you want to accelerate, then let's accelerate, but using the Alliance army as cannon fodder and to clear mines, that's not acceptable. Previously, Gu Hang, Yan Fangxiu, had been quite optimistic, hoping that after the arrival of the Star Realm army, they could leave the main difficult battles to them. But it now seemed that they had been too hopeful, the others just wanted to pick the ripe fruits. So, abandoning illusions, since everyone's life mattered, I didn't plan to sacrifice you to defuse bombs. Why couldn't we just fight this battle fairly and normally, and get it finished quickly? The General Cai Minjin's message was, no. Stop wasting my time with those useless papers. Cai Minjin said, starting from tomorrow, I demand that all reconnaissance troops must set out. 4 days later, a full-scale offensive must begin. At this point, Yan Fangxiu had given up on conventional methods. He said, sorry, General Cai, your order conflicts with another one I have received, and I cannot execute it. Cai Minjin's fierce eyes narrowed, what do you mean? On this planet, militarily, is there anyone whose orders carry more weight than mine? Is it your governor? A brigadier general who isn't even here, what qualifications does he have to command the troops? While speaking, he saw that Yan Fangxiu still had something to say and simply waved him off, interrupting, under the Imperial Wartime Act, I now formally request that you transfer all command of the troops to my headquarters. Do you understand me? As he spoke, he even pulled out a handgun. He didn't voice his threat, but his actions were quite clear. When necessary, he had the authority to execute officers 2 ranks below his. Yan Fangxiu, a colonel, fell precisely within that category. Yan Fangxiu spread his hands and, indeed, said no more. And it was at that moment that a sudden disturbance could be heard from outside. Following that, the curtain to the makeshift headquarters was flung open. Cai Minjin furrowed his brow. This place had already been taken over by his guard squad, and no one could approach without orders. His gaze returned to Yan Fangxiu. Was this colonel causing trouble? Did he really think I wouldn't dare to kill? Under his fierce gaze, Yan Fangxiu remained silent. You're not letting me talk, right? Moments later, the curtain was suddenly swept aside. A towering figure, clad in crimson Terminator power armor with its head bowed, stepped inside. Cai Minjin stood up in surprise, even forgetting to put away his gun. What did he see? A starfighter. In his 30-year military career, he had only fought alongside a starfighter once, and even calling it fighting alongside was a stretch. During that time, he could only be considered a distant observer of their gallant figure on the battlefield. That there were starfighters on Rage Owl Star was not exactly a secret. Gu Hang hadn't deliberately concealed anything. However, after all, Rage Owl Star currently has very little communication with the outside world. The starport has just been built and is still a very small port. There aren't many interstellar travelers. The Star Language Tower, which is used for interstellar communication, only exists in Revival City within Gu Hang's governor office. Given the isolated environment, some well-informed individuals might know a thing or two, but for those who do not pay attention to Rage Owl Star at all, like Cai Minjin, he was truly unaware that there were starfighters active on the planet. General Cai. Cai Minjin subconsciously crossed his arms and performed the Sky Eagle salute, responding, yes. Yes, I am Cai Minjin, Major General of the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion 4th Corps. May I ask who you are? Phoenix Battle Group Commander, Martin Salas. Martins also identified himself, then stated, I have taken over the command of this battle. he succinctly notified Cai Minjin. And General Cai had nothing to say. As he had previously mentioned in the Imperial Wartime Code of Conduct, high-ranking officers of the Star Realm Army have the power, at crucial times, to command officers of lower rank from different systems and unify the command of the planetary defense forces of an entire planet, ensuring that all Imperial Army forces can have unified command in the face of powerful enemies, to avoid confusion. And in this hierarchy clearly defined, a commander of a starfighter battle group sits very high in the order of things. Within the hierarchy of the Star Realm Army, at least an admiral is needed to make suggestions. To contend on equal footing, one would need to produce the rank of a full general, and to command a battle group during wartime, one would need to be a marshal of the Star Realm Army. Of course, rules are dead, people are alive. In a real battle situation, where multiple types of forces and systems work together, who takes charge is usually a matter of discussion. One's high status alone does not translate into real command authority without actual troops to command. But the current situation was obviously not like this. Earlier, Cai Minjin could ignore Yan Fangxiu because he had enough strength at his command. 300,000 troops, plus the estimated 700,000 arriving tomorrow at Rage Owl Star's starport, amounting to 1 million in total, were his confidence. He could act unbridled, having this confidence and the support of both legal and high position. But now, that was not possible. The local forces of Rage Owl Star combined with the Rage Bear Legion also numbered hundreds of thousands, and then there was the appearance of this person wearing Terminator armor, along with a huge physique, which was certainly not a fake starfighter. Now, Cai Minjin couldn't be sure of his victory, neither in terms of position nor in terms of strength. The appearance of Martin's was, of course, Yan Fangxiu's doing. Or rather Gu Hang's doing. Before leaving Rage Owl Star, he had contemplated the issue of military command, fearing that the incoming Star Realm forces would overshadow the local command. Therefore, before his departure, he had a long discussion with Martins and Yan Fangxiu. And now, it really came into play. With Martins leading 30 starfighters, firmly in control of the situation, there were no more ripples in the matter. The Joint Command Center was successfully established, and Cai Minjin honestly merged his own staff with the staff of the Alliance Army, beginning preparations for the battle. He ceased causing trouble. Although he had never heard of the Phoenix before, when 30 starfighters stood before him like 30 grand and solemn statues, he didn't dare make a sound. But Yan Fangxiu and Martins did not engage in any acts of personal vendetta either. In fact, they fully considered Cai Minjin's desire to finish the war quickly, which also aligned with the needs of the Rage Owl Star Alliance, and based on Yan Fangxiu's previous plans, they devised new strategies. A few days later, the fires of war reignited in the West Desert region. 600,000 troops of the Human Alliance marched westward, mightily. At the same time, the remaining 700,000 of Cai Minjin's 4th Corps arrived, and they orderly disembarked from the starport, expected to move to the front line of the Western Front battlefield within 2 to 3 weeks. By then, the number of the Human Alliance forces would directly surpass 1.3 million. The war indeed had to be fought swiftly, for sustaining such a massive army's supply lines posed a severe challenge to the logistics system of the Alliance. Chapter 511. We aim for a quick victory, but the battles on the Alliance's Western Front still dragged on for half a year. By the time nearly a month had elapsed, the following 700,000 Star Realm Army troops had already arrived at the front line. In total, the Alliance Army's 1,300,000 troops could be described as advancing irresistibly in the 5 months that followed, yet they were briefly suppressed by the Mechanical Legion of Blackbird Heavy Industries in some engagements. This side fact highlighted how absurd Cai Minjin's original plan of achieving results in 3 weeks, wrapping up the fight in 6 weeks, and heading back to the Fascist star system for the new year was. If you asked Yan Fangxiu about the root cause, he believed it was the combat effectiveness of the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion Star Realm Army not meeting expectations. In the strictest sense, according to the most standard requirements of the Empire, the combat effectiveness of the Star Realm Army should be strong. In terms of soldier quality, it should be the best of the best. The armies of the Alliance, under the miraculous training of the governor's boot camps, barely met the minimum requirements for the Star Realm Army's new recruits. However, reality begged to differ. From what Yan Fangxiu saw, the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion was indeed a formal Star Realm Army formation, and while it wasn't a well-known legion, logic dictated that it should at least not be worse than the Alliance's forces, right? But in reality, it was a notch lower. Take for example a so-called large regimental formation. Normally, it would consist of 9 enhanced regiments, of which only about 2 would reach the level of Alliance soldiers, and the rest, it's not to say they were just making up numbers, but they were certainly stronger than average soldiers. For instance, the soldiers of the Lumen Kingdom they encountered on Hagian Star were far inferior to them. Yet, compared to the level of Alliance soldiers, it still fell short. That was just the issue with the quality of soldiers. Yan Fangxiu was still unimpressed by their equipment. This Star Realm army lacked even enough troop transport vehicles. If it weren't for the Alliance's ample logistical support, which mobilized a large number of civilian vehicles and newly constructed trains to help with transportation, this Star Realm army would have had to rely on marching thousands of kilometers on foot to reach the Western Front battlefield. By the time they got there, the war might well be over. The Alliance's forces, even the third-tier garrison divisions, combined infantry with heavy artillery, albeit in smaller numbers. But these large regimental formations of the Star Realm army didn't have such integrated units. Infantry regiments were just infantry, artillery regiments were just artillery, and armored regiments were just armor. Yan Fangxiu didn't comment much on this, perhaps it was just a difference in military philosophy. Maybe the troops of the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion believed in concentrating firepower and armor, which wasn't necessarily wrong. Such military formations might be able to exert greater strength in major decisive battle scenarios. But no matter whether it's concentrating firepower and armor, or the Alliance Army's multi-branch composite units that gather firepower and armor when necessary, the overall number of various fire support and technical equipment must be sufficient, right? Under one of their large regimental formations with over 40,000 troops, they were already comparable to 4 brigades of the Alliance. Yet within it, there was only one armored regiment with just over 100 armored vehicles and 40 tanks. Compared to the Wind Extinguishing Brigade with its mere 9,000 troops, they boasted 80 tanks and over 200 armored vehicles. The vehicles and tanks of a single Wind Extinguishing Brigade matched that of 2 large regiments of the Dragonhawk Legion. If that's not a disparity, what is? Even among pure infantry, whether it's the infantry companies in composite brigades or the troops under the infantry divisions, all had completed motorization and had dedicated military vehicles down to the squad level. Each squad had 2 to 3 rocket launchers, each platoon had 1 to 2 mortars, each company had a heavy grenade launcher as a fire support point. The Star Realm Army's infantry regiments also had these things, but they were all concentrated at the regiment level and were also fewer in number. The differences in troop quality and weaponry led to differences in combat performance during the 6 months of battle. Oftentimes, within the same time frame, the progress made by a large 40,000-strong Star Realm Army regiment was comparable to that made by 2 20,000-strong Alliance Brigade regiments. The Alliance was able to achieve the same results with half the number of troops as those of the Dragonhawk Legion's soldiers. In the half-year battle at Rage Owl Star, Cai Minjin didn't make any further trouble. He dutifully played his role as the second in command of the Alliance Army and took care of his own responsibilities. On one hand, Commander Maddens had overshadowed him in terms of legitimacy and status. On the other hand, the combat effectiveness demonstrated by the Alliance forces in actual combat left him with nothing to say. However, in the final stage of the war, a conflict still arose between the two sides. It was when the enemy had almost been entirely wiped out, leaving only one final strategic target, Blackbird City. Maddens devised an attack plan, with the Alliance Army spearheading the assault. But here, Cai Minjin unusually raised an objection. Such an incident hadn't occurred in the past half-year. And both Maddens and Yan Fangxiu understood the thoughts of General Cai. He might have been here on a mission. Though the Fatches family were not the masters of Dragonhawk 3rd Corps, they still had significant influence over this troop that was mainly sourced in manpower and supplies from 3 worlds within the Fatches star system. It was indeed normal for Cai Minjin to have received some special instruction upon leaving. And this instruction was surely related to Blackbird Heavy Industries. The supposed administrator of Blackbird Heavy Industries, Iron Fatches, was still untraceable. In the previous battles, they had repeatedly encountered spider-type mechanical monsters bearing the face of Iron Fatches. Their combat ability was secondary, what was most crucial was that she always seemed to play a key role in the information and command nodes of the Mechanical Legion. Eliminating her would greatly disrupt the strategic coordination capabilities of the Mechanical Legion. But clearly, these were not really Iron Fatches herself. Her actual body was surely still in the center of Blackbird City. Cai Minjin's mission, presumably, was to destroy all evidence that connected Blackbird with the Fatches family. Even though the existence of Iron Fatches and the Fatches family's investment in Blackbird Heavy Industries made their relationship indelible, they were already striving to sever ties, and with the added aggressive attitude, destroying the evidence would make things much more comfortable. In such a situation, Cai Minjin indeed did not wish for the alliance to lead this assault. Even if his own corps suffered considerable casualties in the final attack, he was determined to take on this mission. Maddens thought for a moment and decided not to confront this rare show of backbone from the Imperial Major General. Half a year's peaceful wartime cooperation owed much to this general. Thus, it was appropriate to give him some face in this last battle. He made a decision to let the two forces, one from the south and one from the north, launch a pincer attack on Blackbird City. A fair competition, whoever entered the city first would be king, would that not suffice? Cai Minjin knew this was the best outcome he could possibly have secured. He went back to start preparing his troops, secretly summoning several officers to discuss the battle plans. Although the Alliance army, bearing the name of the Planetary Defense Force, had left a big impression on him, making him dare not underestimate this force that was even stronger than the actual Star Realm army, he was still determined to win this all-important strategic battle. Then, he heard a piece of news. After the military conference, Commander Maddens, personally escorted by 30 fully armed Phoenix soldiers, went north. It was clear he intended to personally join the battle, entering the combat sequences on the side of the Alliance. Inside the command center of the Dragonhawk Third Corps, the once lively strategic discussion abruptly ceased. In a silent room, Cai Minjin furiously threw the document in his hand and burst out cursing. "Can't you play fair?" Chapter 512. Cai Minjin was so angry he was steaming, yet he still had to deploy his troops for an all-out attack. Although upon hearing that the attacking Alliance army from the north had been assisted by the Phoenix Battle Group, he feared the chances of winning this race were slim. However, that didn't mean the Star Realm army would surrender without a fight. But some things cannot be swayed by human will. The forces he had been able to muster to attack Blackbird City amounted to 2 full divisions. Over 70,000 warriors, under fierce artillery cover, engaged in a fight to the death with the enemy in front of them. However, the results were not very good. The troops suffered heavy losses under an irrationally hasty assault. Just as he was considering whether to continue ordering his troops to attack at all costs, he heard news from the northern front. The Alliance army had, led by the Interstellar Warrior Squad, broken into the inner district of Blackbird City. He let out a long sigh, feeling somewhat despondent. Even though it was an anticipated outcome, it still hurt. Nevertheless, he soon calmed down. He had done his best, after all. How could he compete with the likes of the mighty Gundams? Nobody could blame him now. At the same time, he rescinded the order for the troops to attack at all costs, deciding instead to be patient and fight normally. After failing to be the first to enter Blackbird City, to continue sacrificing many lives for it would have been a loss too great. Inside Blackbird City, in the core city area, Maddens flung the mechanical torso that was clinging onto his powered sword. It was the upper half of a machine with the face of iron fetches. In front of him stood a massive machine. This was Blackbird City's energy shield generator. At the moment, the surrounding battle was nearly over, with few remaining enemies who would soon be wiped out by the remaining members of the Interstellar Warrior Squad and the elites of the 10th Brigade. Where they currently stood was the bottom layer of the core city zone. They had not gone straight to the upper floors to find the real body of iron fetches. That task was left to several infantry platoons. Of course, this wasn't to suggest that these infantry platoons would handle it on their own, as there could be unknown risks involved. Their job was just to clear the path, identify the target's location, and either surround it or cut off its escape routes. Afterward, Maddens would lead a team to deal with it personally. But before that, he needed to deal with the shield generator. It wasn't that the existence of this machine was causing any hindrance to the Alliance's advance, that wasn't the case. The energy shield couldn't prevent the approach of slow-moving targets, so the army didn't encounter any problems entering the inner city area, it was just that the artillery couldn't fire directly into it. But with the Interstellar Warrior Squad leading the vanguard, the artillery had entered within the shield's range, so there was no longer any concern about artillery fire being blocked. Maddens was thinking about how to dismantle this thing and move it back. Although it wasn't the biggest, most expensive type that could envelop an entire planet, being able to cover a city was still quite remarkable. The value of this item was at least 4 million tax currency upwards, so to blow it up on the spot would be a terrible waste. Wuxing City of the Alliance was the industrial heart of the entire planet, and with further development to come, such a device was needed for protection. Indeed, if possible, they would love to have every key city equipped with its own city-level energy shield. It's just that the price is a bit too much to bear. Now, to be able to pick up a set and take it back would definitely be good. For this reason, one of the Alliance's chief technical officers, Engine Prophet Huke, even came over on a Wind Falcon. Under the escort of a group of elite soldiers, he began his research. The main task was to safely dismantle this city-level shield generator. The device itself is very large, covering an area of 200 square meters, with a height of 6 meters, heavy and bulky. Transporting the whole thing back would be too strenuous and there was the risk of knocking it about. If possible, the best way was to dismantle it and ship back the parts for reassembly. Maddens exchanged a few words with Huke, then watched this member of the sect of mechanics work, and scanning the surroundings, realized the battle had calmed and knew there was no need for him to stay longer. However, to ensure the safety and continuation of the work here, Maddens still left a squad of Phoenix warriors, led by Anat, in place. He himself, however, led the main force toward the upper district. In this area, several recon units tasked with scouting above had reached a point where it was quite difficult to advance further. Outside the door where Iron Fatch's real body was located, the defense was heavily guarded. The Alliance soldiers had been ordered only to clear the way and scout, they were not required to conquer the target. Upon discovering that the enemy's defense forces were quite strong, the commanders of these units did not require their troops to recklessly engage in combat. They set up heavy firepower, blocking the entrances and exits to prevent anyone from escaping, and occasionally managed to send artillery shells inside. The most critical issues were left to the Interstellar Warrior Squad to resolve. After Maddens arrived with the Phoenix Warriors, they took over the conflict here. All the infantrymen then became supporting roles, following quickly as the Interstellar Warriors cleared the paths, seizing control of the corridors and checking for any remaining enemies. Generally, there were none, as the Interstellar Warriors were not so careless in their work. Making their way through, whether it was the well-armed mechanical guards or the sneakily positioned automated cannon guards, all met the same fate of being dismantled into pieces. Maddens led the team to the front of a massive steel door. He tried using some force, and somewhat to his surprise, the door wasn't locked. Although it was a bit of a struggle, he managed to push the door open. When the door swung open, he saw what lay behind it. In this vast space, there was a throne made of steel. Countless mechanical structures were exposed, numerous pipes, cables, and chains intertwined within, and blue electrical light flickered ceaselessly. Sitting atop the throne was a queen. Upon a closer look, it wasn't so much sitting as her lower body was fused with the machinery of the throne below. Her seemingly human upper body was also just a likeness, her eyes flashed with blue electrical light, and numerous cables extended from the back of her head to the far end of the ceiling. She seemed to be engaged in many complex calculations, with the electric lights resembling countless messages being continuously sent out. This scene shocked the Phoenix Squad members who had entered. Many among them, referred to as Interstellar Warriors, were actually born and raised on Rage Owl Star, never having left it. Their bodies and wills may have reached the level of Interstellar Warriors, but their experiences had yet to catch up. Maddens was an exception. He had seen far too many weird and wonderful things. A quick check confirmed that the human female upper body before him was indeed the likeness of Iron Fatch's. Bang! A gunshot rang out, and the explosive round in Maddens's hand hit the base of the throne, setting off a blast. Unlike the energy shield generator below, such a heretical creation had no value for use, the best course of action was to destroy it immediately. Chapter 513. Maddens's gunshot startled his subordinates awake. Without further words, his actions had already expressed his discontent. The newcomers of Phoenix still felt a bit ashamed, they should not have been daunted just by witnessing something unexpected. Now, the only way to redeem themselves in the eyes of their displeased commander was through practical action. They spread out silently and swiftly, keeping a watchful eye for any potential enemies while dispersing throughout the area. They began placing bombs in various locations to ensure that everything within the building would be destroyed. Meanwhile, Maddens casually walked forward to Iron Fatch's, whose eyes were still flickering with electricity. He drew out his power sword. And at that moment, the woman with only half a body left, her eyes' electric glimmer subsided, revealing the human-like pupils underneath. "Human, please hear me." Maddens, without uttering a second word, raised his power sword high and cut her in half at the waist. With a crackle of electricity, Iron Fatch's body was pulled by the tubing at the back of her head, drooping without falling. But the words she had not finished saying were still coming out. "Say, no matter how you view the god of many changes, the will under the throne of the mechanical god has never changed." Maddens, silent, raised his sword again and severed the many tubes connected to the back of Iron Fetch's head as well. This really caused her speech to become intermittent, filled with shrieks of static. Betwixt the squeals and whirs, she managed to leave one last sentence. Ever tolerant of humans, always gracious, there's always a place for you, flesh is frail, mech. Behind Madden's, a few elite soldiers approached carrying a black coffin. They incorporated the half-mechanical, half-human carcass of Iron Fetches into it. Then, more of Ms. Wu Jiarong's direct disciples, wearing sealed iron masks, started checking every part of the machine silently and solemnly, collecting data, searching for anything of value. Madden's hesitated. He had intended to stop these people's actions. As he had thought earlier, such sacrilege should not exist in this world at all. Listening to those few blasphemous words spoken by Iron Fetches had only confirmed this belief. However, in the end, Madden's did not voice his objections. These people must have come on the orders of Ms. Wu Jiarong, and Wu Jiarong was a technical officer greatly trusted by the governor, who mostly refrained from meddling in external affairs. Her sudden dispatch of a team for this task suggested great importance, and it was very possible that the governor was aware of it. After considering the matter, Madden's decided not to escalate the issue. Thinking of the governor's capabilities, perhaps there wouldn't be any issues, right? The governor that Madden's was pondering was currently on Corolla 3. Gu Heng was aware of the events transpiring in Blackbird City. Madden's was right, Wu Jiarong, who normally avoided external affairs, had acted upon Gu Heng's instructions. The reason stemmed from the moment the Allied forces came near Blackbird City. While on Corolla 3, Gu Heng noticed the event option flashing incessantly on the system interface. Upon clicking it, he discovered an unknown event that could be unlocked for 200 points of grace. This was similar to the initial activation of the Phoenix Will Die event, a mystery that became clear only after unlocking it. Considering the returns from that time and also factoring in the abundance of grace points at his disposal, over 30,000 accumulated over 6 months, on top of what was previously saved, the 200 points expenditure seemed trivial. Even if it turned out to be a worthless event, Gu Heng could opt to ignore it and not proceed. Once the event was unlocked, it was named Iron Mystery. Event activated, Iron Mystery. Your planet is experiencing an iron rebellion, but have you ever been curious about how, during humanity's conquest of the universe, all intelligent devices, which were once the greatest aids to humans, eventually became anathemas feared throughout human society? Search for clues related to the irons, conduct research, and perhaps you will gradually discover some answers. Reward unknown. Gu Heng admitted that there were certain risks involved with this. For such blasphemous entities, the most reasonable course of action, in accordance with Empire regulations, was to annihilate them immediately upon discovery, eradicating all traces of their existence without mercy. The reason for such stringent and absolute rules regarding these blasphemous entities was, of course, due to the painful experiences the human empire had suffered during past encounters with such entities, and the lessons learned therefrom. This approach was undoubtedly the safest. However, on one hand, Gu Heng was genuinely curious about the questions raised by the event. On the other hand, the unknown reward tantalized him. Of course, if this had been a gift from some other entity, wrapped up in the most attractive packaging, he would not have accepted it so readily. But this came from his system. It's not that he absolutely trusted his system 100%. Maybe it was a plot conceived by a subspace evil god, with some grand, shocking conspiracy at play? Chapter 514. But Gu Heng considered himself to have one advantage, that is, he doesn't overthink meaningless things. First of all, since he had obtained the system up until now, over 2.5 years, he had used it frequently, and this thing had never betrayed him. Second, and most importantly, he had already been using the system for 2.5 years, and he expected to continue using it frequently in the future. So under these circumstances, what's the point in worrying about whether the system has any malicious intent? If it really were some subspace evil god's conspiracy, Gu Heng would have already been deeply ensnared. In such a situation, without much consideration, Gu Heng had Wu Jiarong dispatch people to investigate the scene and to bring back Iron Fetch's body for research. To tell the truth, he didn't know whether this was the way to solve this so-called Iron Man puzzle, but anyway, he might as well do it. Of course, while he trusted the system, he still needed to be careful in handling specific matters. When Wu Jiarong was researching this thing, a new research institute would be established, completely isolated from those black boxes. Throughout the research process, all researchers would be sequestered and must adhere to a series of research rules, undergo regular health checks, and try to avoid the problem of corruption as much as possible. Regarding the Iron Man puzzle, Gu Heng soon put it aside without giving it much more thought. After all, it could only be considered a leisurely move, whether there were any benefits or what the rewards were, he would address those questions later. Gu Heng was more concerned about the battle itself. Blackbird Battle Assessment, resounding victory, 22,990 points of grace awarded. Total losses 119,384, eliminated 764,023. Star Realm Army Dragonhawk 3rd Legion, Allies losses 74,847, eliminated 416,167. Star Realm Army Rage Bear Legion, losses 12,697, eliminated 97,016. Allied Counties Central Group Army, losses 31,840, eliminated 250,840. A total of 76,000 enemies were eliminated, while the Allied forces had a total loss of 111,000. These losses included not only those killed in action but also non-combat injuries and other reductions in manpower. Those who could return to the military and restore their combat effectiveness after not too long a treatment period were not included in these statistics. The actual number of fatalities was approximately 60 to 70,000. Overall, the casualty ratio was 1:7, which is quite a good number. However, the actual combat power of both sides was not as disparate as the data suggests. The Allied troops, fully equipped and with ample logistical support, if you eliminate ambushes, surprise attacks, and the like, could achieve a confrontation ratio of approximately 1:4 in a straightforward battle. The Star Realm Army was worse, only achieving 1:2.5. However, sometimes the victorious side in a war, at certain critical junctures, can break through, encircle the enemy, and execute annihilation campaigns, after which the victory often becomes significantly greater. The reverse is also true, regardless of what the exchange rate on the front lines might be. If you lose and let the enemy score a decisive annihilation victory, such as cutting off logistics or encircling you, preventing ammunition and supplies from reaching you, then whether Allied soldiers or Star Realm warriors, all would be easily wiped out in large numbers. It's just a pity that all these things only happened to those mechanical monsters. Humanity was the victorious side. And this brought Gu Heng a bounty of over 20,000 points of grace. Up to now, counting the monthly accumulations of grace points from the past 6 months, his current total had already exceeded 50,000 points. It felt like he could do quite a lot with that. But no rush. Right now, Gu Heng wasn't even on Rage Owl Star, he couldn't go about making moves even if he wanted to. He had already been here for half a year, returning to Rage Owl Star a few times in between, while spending the rest of his time on Corollia 3, cooperating with investigations. The death of Apostle of War Bajoya Galaraldo brought about an impact and aftermath that was even more severe than imagined. First, the Tianma Star sector mobilized elites from all sides as much as possible to form an investigation team. A Mother Superior and the State Archbishop of the Corollia Diocese were considered major figures. It's just that within the Tianma Star sector, the influence of the sect of mechanics was very weak, with the highest-ranking individual being merely a mechanical priest. The Psychic Cultivators Association didn't fare much better, their president being only a C-class spiritual energy wielder. Overall, however, they assembled the most outstanding individuals from all sides they possibly could. Among them was Gu Heng, the person involved and also an A-class spiritual energy wielder. The investigation by the Tianma Star sector itself lasted about half a month, and their ultimate conclusion was that it had been a demon attack, where the Apostle of War had tragically fallen into an abyssal rift. However, the explanation given by this investigative team from the Tianma Star sector was clearly not convincing. It wasn't a matter of whether the evidence was sufficient, or whether the investigation methods could withstand scrutiny. What mattered most was that the identity and status of the deceased were too important, and the investigative team's own status was too low. Half a month later, an investigative group from the Dragonhawk Star Domain's capital, Yunluo Star, arrived. This team was considerably larger, headed by a judge from the tribunal, including a whole squad of the tribunal's elite, the State Church, Sect of Mechanics, and Psychic Cultivators Association all gathered, sending representatives from both the administrative and military affairs departments. This entire colossal investigative team also brought along a fleet and land forces. At their request, everyone who had participated in the banquet that day was not allowed to leave Corollia 3 and had to undergo the investigation again. Their investigation hadn't yielded any results yet when an investigative team from the Eastern Cosmos domain arrived. Its structure was similar to the Star Domain's investigative team, but the tier was higher. Then came the recent news that an investigation group representing the Sun Lord and coming from the Solar Expedition Army was en route. However, given their great distance, it was estimated that the investigative group wouldn't arrive until a year later. The situation was getting more and more blown out of proportion. The leaders Paydesi and Governor Akuna both felt numbed already. They had previously been considering how to lighten their responsibilities, but now they were resigned to the fact that there was nothing to hope for. They had a certain degree of influence over the Dragonhawk Star Domain's investigative team, but by the time the matter reached the Space Domain government, their influence was almost negligible, not to mention the team that would arrive a year later, carrying the wrath of the Sun Lord. With such a grand scale of operation, even Gu Hang began to feel a bit nervous. The universe was too vast, and the empire too large, teeming with capable and extraordinary people. Who could say for sure whether there wouldn't be a few formidable individuals capable of uncovering something? However, after much consideration, he was still relatively reassured. Even if the arrivals were formidable to the point where they could pull Galaraldo back from the fatherly domain and interrogate him personally about what happened, Galaraldo could only say he was unlucky to have been attacked by demons. He hadn't seen Gu Hang take action. The entire incident was caused by a plague demon, so the blame couldn't be pinned on Gu Hang. Nevertheless, being confined to Karolia 3 and unable to leave was quite troublesome. In the half-year there, besides being investigated and investigating others, Gu Hang often made calls home, constantly maintaining communication with Ozania, Lambert, Tadeus, Yan Fangxiu, and others. Currently, the situation on Rage Owl Star was good. In the 6 months of his absence, not only had there been no chaos, but they also relied on the Star Realm Army to completely exterminate Blackbird Heavy Industries and win the Unification War. This proved that the alliance system established by Gu Hang was reliable, able to operate even without him. Yet, he still had a sense of crisis. For a ruler, being away from the center of power for a long period was never a good thing. He was planning a return trip to Rage Owl Star. If it had been before, it would have been difficult for Gu Hang to go back. But now, there were ways. Gu Hang sought out an acquaintance, Zhang Guangen. An A-class spiritual energy wielder, chief mage of the Dragonhawk Star Domain Star Law Hall, as well as a senior member of the Eastern Cosmos Domain Psychic Cultivators Association Mage Council, he represented both the Space Domain government and the Star Domain government, holding not an insignificant right to speak within the current investigative team. Gu Hang had gotten along very well with him over the past few months. Chapter 515. Ha! Our genius has arrived. The speaker was Zhang Guangen. He was a portly man currently in the midst of a banquet. Most of the attendees at the banquet were from the Psychic Cultivators Association, local psychics from the Tianma Star sector. Upon hearing that an A-grade psychic, namely Gu Hang, had appeared in their star sector, many psychics from various planets rushed over. When they heard that the widely known Zhang Guangen from the entire Cosmos domain had arrived as well, the number of visitors increased substantially. Zhang Guangen was adept at social interaction, far more a politician than a scholarly figure or a reclusive and mentally sensitive psychic. Gu Hang, a true politician, sometimes didn't have the patience to receive the numerous visitors individually, but Zhang Guangen was willing to do so. This might have been the difference between someone like Gu Hang, who held authority in his own right, and an official like Zhang Guangen who worked under a larger system. At Zhang Guangen's enthusiastic invitation, Gu Hang joined the banquet. Amid the clinking of cups and toasts, Gu Hang chatted with the attendees, exchanging what could only be described as trivial pleasantries. He didn't like such occasions, but that didn't mean he wasn't good at them. And how could the perceptive Zhang Guangen not know that Gu Hang's visit was to seek him out for a matter? He enjoyed the feeling of being flattered, but after arriving in the Tianma Star sector, what mattered to him most was Gu Hang. An A-grade psychic was a rare find. In the Dragonhawk Star domain, there was only one, and in the entire Eastern Cosmos domain, which totaled over 2,000 planets, there weren't more than 100 A-grade psychics. Every A-grade psychic was a valuable treasure. Adding one meant that the entire star domain had a higher say in the upper echelons of the Psychic Cultivators Association. There were significant interests involved. The value of one Gu Hang was many times greater than the Psychic Cultivators Association of the entire Tianma Star sector combined. Soon, Zhang Guangen had the others continue the banquet and interaction while he, personally, took Gu Hang to a private room with a terrace. "What's up, young Gu? Is there something you want to discuss with me?" he asked with a smile, with no visible movement of his hands, yet teacups, a teapot and plates slowly flew over, pouring tea and setting themselves up on the small table on the terrace. In a matter of moments, a set of tea and snacks for conversation was arranged. Gu Heng, without being polite, took a sip and expressed his admiration, then got down to business. I'm thinking of leaving Corollia 3 for a while to return to Rage Owl Star. Zhang Guang'an frowned. He took a sip of his tea, then said, this is a bit difficult to manage. According to the investigation team's requirements, no one is allowed to leave the planet. You are a member of the investigation team, so you should know the rules. So doesn't that bring me to you? Gu Heng was of course good at speaking nicely. Your face carries much more weight than mine. Rules are dead, there must be some flexibility. I ask the Grand Mage for guidance. Ha ha ha. Gu Heng's somewhat flattering words made Zhang Guang'an laugh heartily. The delighted Grand Mage said, if it were someone else, then undoubtedly there would be no bending the rules, strict impartiality. But for you, well, there could indeed be some ways to think about it. Please, Grand Mage, think if you can help. In fact, this was just a pretext. Gu Heng himself was a member of the investigation team. He was well aware of the workings of the investigation teams from the star sector to the star domain to the cosmos domain. In truth, by this time, the investigation work was not only lightweight but could practically be said to be idle. Half a year had passed since the incident occurred. What evidence could there be left to find? It was merely a matter of checking each person who was present at the time and the entire environment of Corollia 3. As for the elimination of suspects, it was pretty much conclusive. There were plenty with the motive. Since the war apostle had offended many, however, none had the capability to commit the crime. If one insists the incident was man-made, then the perpetrator must have been a very powerful entity, possessing some unknown method, and had the ability to carry it out. And the doer must not have been present at the scene, perhaps no longer even in the Tianma star sector. The probability of this was very low. The consensus among the three investigation teams was that the incident was, with high probability, an accident. This conclusion was supported by the fact that in the half-year since the incident, the Abyss's invasions on Corollia 3 had become increasingly severe. Theoretically, at this stage, the case could be closed. With the final conclusion coming directly from the investigation team dispatched by the Eastern Cosmic Realm government, the persuasiveness should already be high. Next, the investigation team would wrap up, the matter would largely be concluded, and the outcome reported to the Central Empire, where the Supreme Council of Holy Terra would sign off, and the whole case would be officially settled. However, Galaraldo's unique status lay in the fact that his death would directly shock the Sun Lord himself. This was the individual who directly oversaw the Terra Council and could be considered the de facto supreme ruler of the Empire, not so easily convinced by local government conclusions. He didn't even allow the central government to send an investigation team, but formed one directly from his own expeditionary force. Chapter 516. There's nothing we can do then, everyone has to wait here. There's nothing to do, and we can't leave. We still have to wait almost a year. There are quite a few people with grievances, not just one or two. This includes the investigation teams of the three levels themselves, who are also resentful. To travel all the way to your Tianma star sector and then have to wastefully linger here for another year, who would be happy with that? In such circumstances, it's hardly surprising that some incidents have occurred. Everyone here is someone with a reputation to uphold, showing off their own magic tricks. Leaving for a while isn't unthinkable. One riskier method involves pretending to stay here while actually having left, as long as one returns before the delegation of the Sun Lord arrives. Of course, the risk lies in being reported, which is quite troublesome, and you need someone to take this risk for you. Locals from Tianma Star Sector basically shouldn't expect this kind of treatment, especially Paydesi and Akuna, who are key figures with leadership responsibilities. There's fear they may flee. Besides the risk, there's another nauseating point. After leaving in this manner, you can't be too high profile while carrying out your affairs outside, otherwise the facade of staying in Corollia would fall apart. But Gu Heng clearly isn't too willing to adopt this method. Here, Zhang Guang'an offered Gu Heng a second option. Aren't you the governor of Rage Owl Star? Yes. A year and a half ago, there were signs of a demon invasion on Rage Owl Star, and even the emergence of a very powerful demon incarnation, but it was suppressed by you all, right? Yes. There have also been cult activities on your planet, and even the Ironman rebellion, which has just been quelled, right? Yes. Sheesh. Gu, if you take my advice, don't bother with that planet and come to Yunluo with me. We could work together to expand and strengthen the Psychic Cultivators Association. Wouldn't that be nice? Archmage, you jest. Gu Heng was somewhat helpless. Such talk, while it was still okay back on Rage Owl Star, would invariably provoke such a remark anywhere else once they heard what Rage Owl Star had been through. All right, I won't persuade you further, Zhang Guang'en said. However, since these events have happened on Rage Owl Star, it would make sense for the investigation team to go there and perhaps find some clues, don't you think? Gu Heng feigned a look of sudden realization. He certainly had thought of this idea long ago, but it was best that Zhang Guang'en suggested it. It would seem a bit off if he made the suggestion himself. Zhang Guang'en chuckled, as a member of the investigating team, you can certainly go. However, the identity of the Star Sector investigation team is not enough, you need to join the Star Domain investigation team at least. What about that matter I mentioned to you before? Have you considered it? Gu Heng spoke earnestly, I have made up my mind. I am willing to join the Psychic Cultivators Association Star Law Hall in the Dragonhawk Star Domain and serve as your deputy, contributing to the development of the association. However, I should establish a branch of the association on Rage Owl Star and develop the association's power in the Tianma Star Sector. In the affairs of the association, I will support every decision you make. Zhang Guang'en felt slightly disappointed that he couldn't lure Gu Heng over to the stellar capital, but he quickly let it go, thinking it might even be a blessing. After all, there was only one A-rank spiritual energy user in the stellar capital Yunluo Star. Having another one might cause trouble. Gu Heng, as he now seemed, was polite and not ambitious, but who knows what could happen once he made the move. Having him outside yet contributing the influence of an A-rank spiritual energy user, being able to uphold the association's presence and even stepping in when necessary, achieved his goal. All right, that settles it. I'll issue the appointment decree from the Star Law Hall right now and recommend you to join the Star Domain investigation team. Once the information is filed, you will lead a team to Rage Owl Star to investigate the source of the abyssal erosion, to see if it's related to the disappearance of the Apostle Galaraldo. The investigation period, let's say 3 months, and you can extend it if it's not enough. However, during this time, you must frequently return to report the situation. You can't really stay on Rage Owl Star for the whole 3 months, understood? I understand. Gu Heng was actually still a bit annoyed. Even though traveling from the Corollia star system to the Rage Owl star system only required a single stellar jump, the one-way journey still took a minimum of 6 days, and a round trip would waste 12 days on the road. After several such round trips, he feared that half of his 3-month investigation period would be wasted in transit. But there was nothing he could do about it. Ultimately, it was a situation of his own making, so he had to bear with it. As for a subdivision of the investigation team accompanying him to Rage Owl Star, so be it. The leader of the team was Gu Heng himself. Could he possibly find fault with himself? Even if there was someone stubborn enough to investigate their leader, Gu Heng was not afraid. With 3 levels of investigation teams unable to find anything on Corollia 3, could they possibly discover anything on Rage Owl Star? There was only one thing that he truly feared being investigated: the black box. But he decided that this time when he returned, he would collect all the black boxes into the Storm God Kingdom. Without Gu Heng's permission, no one could enter the Storm God Kingdom. Unless they forcibly broke in. In the entire empire, Gu Heng didn't think that there were many who could manage that, especially not here. As for Gu Heng himself joining the Psychic Cultivators Association, it was a matter of little consequence. What would he need to give up? Nothing but the title and influence of an A-grade spiritual energy user. On the contrary, he could gain something from it. It wasn't as if he was required to do anything specific. If they really wanted him to fight, he could simply refuse. The Psychic Cultivators Association didn't possess that much binding power, especially not over someone like him. Waiting for the investigation team to approve the procedures took some time. And Gu Heng, having some spare time while he waited, made a trip to Nest capital Pheno City. It was an occupied area. Pheno City, with a population of 10 billion, had become a massive den of demons, a veritable abyssal hell. An imperial army of at least 10 million people struggled within it. Among them, 7 million were from the Planetary Defense Force of Corollia 3. This army's level of strength and equipment perfectly matched people's stereotype of a planetary defense force. Weak, poor equipment, Problematic discipline and morale. Despite a population of 40 billion on Karolia 3, the planet's productivity couldn't keep up with the number of people. A significant portion of the population, fundamentally, was no different from pigs raised for slaughter, merely a source of taxes. To say Karolia was wealthy was indeed true, it paid 4 billion in imperial taxes a year. To call it dirt poor was also accurate. Not only were the people poor, but to support such a vast population compounded by severe corruption and administrative inefficiency meant that aside from the populace, there were hardly any valuable outputs. Under such circumstances, they simply could not afford a large, elite army. The military forces on Karolia 3 numbered around 200 million, making up about 0.5% of the entire populace. Most of them could not be mobilized and were tasked with suppressing any revolts across various nest capitals to avoid uprisings. Every moment, in each of the nest capitals, the lowest class, who lived worse than dogs and pigs, were on the verge of rebellion. With life being untenable either way, any incitement could escalate into a riot. They'd fight with an iron rod if they had to. Those troops were responsible for crushing such rebellions and could not be moved lightly. Being able to deploy 7 million was no small feat. They were primarily tasked with establishing a perimeter blockade around the entire nest capital. Additionally, some were used as cannon fodder and mobilized by the Star Realm Army. This Star Realm Army referred to the 3 million soldiers of the Dragonhawk Third Corps. The first batch consisted of only 1 million men, but over the half-year, reinforcements arrived 4 times, bringing the total to 3 million. The one in charge was a major general named Jeden Hansen from the Empire. He was the deputy corps commander of the Dragonhawk Third Corps. Aside from the Dragonhawk Third Corps, there was another less conspicuous force present. It was a contingent of 77,000 from the Rage Bear Legion, originating from Rage Owl Star. The commander of this force was the colonel of the 3rd Beast Slaying Brigade, Lucy Lee Koxi. Chapter 517. Lucy Lee Koxi was one of the few whose military rank did not diminish during the transition from the Alliance Army to the Star Realm Army sequence, eventually becoming part of the Rage Bear Legion. For instance, Yan Fengxue was initially promised the position of Legion Commander, at least holding the rank of Brigadier General, but in the end, Galaraldo's interference left him as second in command with only the rank of Colonel. Compared to his formal rank of Major General within the Alliance structure, he had fallen 2 levels. Lee Kexi, however, fared much better. Originally a colonel in the Alliance, her rank should have dropped to Lieutenant Colonel during the Star Realm Army grading, just like other division and brigade commanders. However, Gu Hang, as Legion Commander, quickly pulled her back up to the rank of Colonel within the scope of his authority as Legion Commander and Brigadier General. He had the power to do so. It was merely a matter of nomination, submission, and waiting for approval. Gu Hang was at Karolia 3, with representatives from various investigation groups and the Military Affairs Department present, so the process went quite smoothly. The reason Lee Kexi's rank was pulled up a notch was to officially empower her to consolidate command of the half-strength Rage Bear Legion that had come to Karolia 3. As per Galaraldo's request, the Military Affairs Department had issued orders for the Rage Bear Legion to participate in the war at Karolia 3. 77,000 Rage Bear warriors, away from home for half a year, were fighting in this foreign land. She commanded 7 division and brigade units, equating to 2 large regiments in terms of Star Realm Army numbers. The Supreme Commander of the Karolia Battle Zone, Major General Jeden Hansen, did not take them seriously at first. Over 70,000 people mattered little in the grand scheme of battles like the fallen nest capital Pheno City, where millions were involved. He regarded it as a superfluous move, an act of people manipulation by Galaraldo, the apostle of war. Of course, he was not on good terms with Galaraldo, had no entanglements of interest, and now that the apostle's life or death was unknown, he had no need to please a dead man, just conduct business officially and fairly. The Rage Bear Legion wasn't his direct unit, so he wouldn't grant them special treatment. While Gu Hang was their Legion commander and had just displayed A-level spiritual energy capabilities, making him quite popular in the current special situation on Karolia 3, Hansen wouldn't purposefully sacrifice the Rage Bear Legion. The 77,000 members of the Rage Bear Legion received the standard treatment of the Star Realm Army, taking on some routine military tasks. However, Major General Hansen quickly realized something was amiss. Wasn't the Rage Bear Legion supposed to have been just a planetary defense force half a year ago? They had only recently transformed into the Star Realm Army. But why were they so fierce? He allocated tasks based on the amount of work a normal 2-regiment large unit should assume. Yet, This group managed to complete tasks relatively easily, and under Colonel Lee Kexey's command, they often provided additional aid to nearby friendly forces. 2 months prior, during a large-scale plague demon uprising, tens of thousands of native soldiers, forming a defense forces, were defeated at an undercity exit. Tens of thousands of plague corpses, along with a large number of higher-grade plague demons, broke through to the quarantine zone. At least 300,000 uninfected individuals were still in that quarantine zone, undergoing identification and evacuation. Hansen did not wish to abandon them, so he assembled 2 regiment-sized units and contested the area again. However, the number of enemies was unexpectedly immense, seemingly endless. His troops soon found themselves in a tough fight, and the tens of thousands of native troops who later came to support dissolved like water in the desert, quickly evaporating without much effect. The area turned into a quagmire and a meat grinder within a week, with over 400,000 human soldiers ensnared, surpassing the number of civilians awaiting rescue in that region. Worse still, when Hansen considered abandoning the area, pulling out the troops, and destroying the entrance to prevent further losses, he was distraught to find that retreat would be incredibly difficult. His numerous troops, locked in a chaotic battle with the plague demons, were strung throughout the complex architecture of the entire district. It wasn't a situation from which one could easily retreat. A mismanaged retreat could turn into a rout, with the safety of 400,000 soldiers at stake, including 2 regiments of Star Realm forces, a considerable force. In the worst-case scenario, the chaos could allow the demons to strike the next district and trigger a domino collapse across the entire Pheno City blockade line. This wasn't mere speculation, as a large regiment of the Dragonhawk Legion was already suffering. At that moment, an unexpected force emerged from the skies. It was a composite camp from the 35th Brigade of the Rage Bear Legion. The combined assault of tanks and armored vehicles was resolute, and the timing and position they chose were particularly tricky. It was a critical moment when the enemy was about to encircle over 30,000 Dragonhawk warriors and block the retreat path. If one mentioned tanks and armored vehicles, the Dragonhawk Legion certainly had them. Everyone used the Lion and the Wanderer models, nobody was inherently better than the others. But the difference lay in the fact that their composite camp had far tighter infantry-tank coordination than the Dragonhawk Legion. The armored infantry units deploying from the armored vehicles and the motorized infantry units could keep pace with the advancing armor units, securing the breach firmly. This not only prevented the enemy formation from healing their wound but also protected the armored units from being surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces during their assault. Chapter 518. And then, the artillery support platoon would swiftly move into position. In the urban environment of Nest Capital, the power of artillery was greatly diminished. The entirety of Nest Capital, rather than being a vast complex of buildings, could more accurately be described as if the whole city itself were a massive structure. Although there were some open spaces, the presence of various obstacles generally made it impossible for artillery to provide accurate fire support over a distance of 20 kilometers. However, this did not mean that the artillery was useless. Difficult to fire from a distance, but not at close range? Facing the threat of the enemy, with the help of their armored and infantry brethren at the front, they could forcefully construct fire support points to lob fire in an almost direct fire manner to places within their reach. Their fire coverage, from the usual 20 kilometers in open field conditions, was reduced to just 2 kilometers, and even then, they were often blocked from having clear lines of sight. But heavy artillery was still heavy artillery, and it could still devastate any target within its reach. The highly skilled and smooth coordination of the composite camp left many officers of the Star Realm Army who witnessed this spectacle dumbfounded. The fluidity of their offensive, like mercury pouring down, not only shattered many of their preconceived notions but also truly preserved the lifeline of the entire division. They did not let their brothers in the Rage Bear Legion fight alone. Soon enough, multiple platoons came to their aid, helping the warriors of the Rage Bear Legion secure this retreat route. Then, the entire division began to retreat in an orderly fashion, as ordered, withdrawing from this hopelessly lost district. Without a doubt, this composite camp of the Rage Bear Legion had performed an extraordinary feat. Their arrival not only saved an entire division but also prevented the area from falling into utter ruin. Although it was not a complete reversal of the situation, turning defeat into victory, it could still be considered as saving a building from near collapse. The key point was that this was a combat group of less than 1,000 soldiers. The incident caught the attention of Major General Hansen. On one hand, it resolved a major crisis, allowing him to finally get a good night's sleep. On the other hand, he was astonished at how the Rage Bear Legion's troops could suddenly appear there and exhibit such formidable fighting strength. The answer to this didn't require his personal investigation. The multitude of staff under his command provided him with the answers. The large staff team quickly delivered the report to the Major General's desk. The appearance of a Rage Bear Legion unit on the battlefield wasn't particularly surprising. They had been sent to a nearby area earlier for a routine clearance mission. They completed their mission successfully, and even finished several days ahead of schedule. While the troops were stationed locally, awaiting the takeover by the Planetary Defense Forces, Colonel Lee Kexey noticed the changing situation nearby and sent a camp over to check things out. And with that inspection, they resolved the situation. Another matter that deserved Major General Hansen's careful consideration was this. Why were the Rage Bear Legion troops so formidable with the same equipment and not a large number of soldiers? According to reports from the staff, the first reason was that every soldier in the Rage Bear Legion met the standard requirements of the Star Realm Army. Interestingly enough, although there were certainly many among the Dragonhawk Third Corps' 20+ million troops who reached this level, the overall proportion was only about half, and among that half, another half had reached this level only after arriving at the Star Realm Army. This shouldn't have been the case, but it was the reality stemming from an unavoidable situation. The soldiers of the Star Realm Army mainly come from the troops offered by various planets along with their payment of Imperial tax, and it was also possible for the Star Realm Army to simply transfer troops from the Planetary Defense Forces into their ranks. But the standard level of the Star Realm Army generally required at least 5 years of military training under experienced instructors before soldiers could meet the criteria. On many planets, the total service time for conscripts and volunteers wasn't even that long. Of course, theoretically, none of this should have been a concern for the Star Realm Army. The Military Affairs Department, the Star Realm Army Command, weren't supposed to handle these issues. If a planet didn't provide qualified soldiers, it shouldn't count towards their tax obligations. But political and economic considerations, coupled with corruption factors. There was no remedy. Hansen was only a major general, after all, he couldn't change these things. What he could do was ensure that, once soldiers came to his force, at least they could be trained into competent warriors through his efforts. But even that was difficult to achieve. During peacetime, when there were no wars, the budget of the Star Realm Army was insufficient, offering no opportunity to fully let the soldiers practice their military skills. Without enough bullets, there could be no sharpshooters. The situation for artillerymen, tank crews, and the like was the same. But if it were just a difference in the quality of soldiers, it wouldn't result in such significant concrete outcomes. After all, Dragonhawk's warriors are not weak. This brings us to the third factor mentioned by the staff officers, tactical concept. The composite forces model adopted by the Rage Bear Legion is not exactly a novel idea. The Star Realm Army is full of talented individuals, wouldn't they have thought of it? Of course, they have. To put it plainly, the advantage of composite forces lies in the flexibility of modular, small unit sizes, more officers under the same troop strength, a high concentration of technical equipment, and various troop types coordinating under a single command system. It all sounds good, but each of these advantages comes at a cost. Smaller unit sizes and flattened command structures mean more officers are needed, which costs money. Whether it's training officers or providing them with higher compensation after they're trained, the expenses are considerable. A high concentration of technical equipment translates directly to money. Various troop types coordinating requires a significant amount of training, which again means money. The Military Affairs Department and the Star Realm Army, of course, have a lot of money, but they have even more places to spend it on. All these advantages do not outweigh the benefits of maintaining more soldiers with less money under the current large unit division system. And in a major frontal battle, large formations have their benefits. Composite forces can only be a small-scale approach to creating elite troops within the entire system of the Star Realm Army. To be honest, Major General Hansen couldn't understand why Governor Gu Heng would be willing to use such an army to pay the imperial tax. It's just not worth it, too honest. Isn't the standard practice to randomly pick tens of thousands of warriors trained for a year or two, equip them with suitable light gear, try to establish good relationships, and then just settle it? That way, for 1 million tax currency paid, the actual cost would be only 700,000. The way you're doing it now amounts to a cost of 1,300,000 to offset a tax of 1 million. A complete loss. Regardless, this was good news for Hansen. He suddenly discovered that he had 70,000 elite troops at his disposal. Although there was only one brigade of true armored composite camps, the several infantry divisions from Rage Bear were all motorized, and the firepower of weapons like heavy pounder guns was distributed down to the company level, with squad weaponry also packing more punch than the same number of Star Realm army forces. In any case, they were stronger than his own forces. In a mix of emotions, he didn't hesitate to start assigning this army from Rage Owl Star to more important tasks more frequently. This was different from using them as cannon fodder. Supplies and logistics were given the highest priority. When acting as the tip of the spear, they also needed a hilt, so support and coordinating units behind them were also plentiful in numbers. In fact, during joint attacks, he would generously hand over command to Colonel Lee Kexi instead of senior officers from the Dragonhawk Legion. In addition, when it came to winning battles, he was anything but stingy with rewards. From combat allowances for warriors and officers to reporting achievements of entire units to the Military Affairs Department, he was meticulous. When Gu Hang came to Pheno City and met Lee Kexi, Major General Hansen, who had also heard the news, hurried over for a meeting. He sincerely thanked Gu Hang and also expressed some apologies. After all, no matter how well he ensured the logistics or reported their accomplishments, the increased casualties from taking on more significant military duties were unavoidable. Gu Hang expressed his understanding in return. Although he was distressed by the casualties among his own soldiers, the combat actions of the Rage Bear warriors in this theater were indeed bringing real benefits and advantages. After all, when the Star Realm army fights, they're not just going through the motions. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hinted to Lee Kexi that it was okay to perform normally in battle. Otherwise, even if they were just going through the motions, the command level of the Dragonhawk Legion wouldn't notice. Chapter 519. What are the benefits of fighting for the Empire as part of the Star Realm Army? For the Rage Owl Star Alliance government, there are no direct benefits. But for Gu Hang, that may not be the case. He originally did not wish to personally take on the role of Legion Commander of the Rage Bear Legion, preferring to have Yan Fangxiu do it while he stayed behind the scenes, which was a better option. However, now that he had assumed this position, he resolved to accept it and sought to make the most of the situation by looking for any potential value and opportunities that he could exploit. And there were indeed such opportunities. First was prestige, an indirect commodity, but a valuable one. He wasn't a lone wolf. As a politician and leader of a faction, silently accumulating wealth and slowly developing was not the only strategy. Certainly, aspects like technological advancement and the development of the planet's industrial capacity did not need to be publicized, they were akin to inner cultivation. But now, as Rage Owl Star gradually moved towards the Star Sea and engaged in interstellar exchanges, the importance of prestige, an intangible asset, should not be underestimated. For instance, Gu Hang's demonstration of A-level spiritual energy user capabilities was an enhancement of his personal prestige. And this kind of thing, prestige, could be monetized, albeit with certain methods and abilities. He was already capitalizing on it. The forthcoming establishment of the Psychic Cultivators Association branch on Rage Owl Star was one such way to cash in. This branch would receive funding from the headquarters of the Tianma Cultivators Association, it could access precious materials for training spiritual energy users, Gu Hang would have an official excuse to train spiritual energy users and could issue legal licenses to them. All these were crucial. The funding amount didn't matter, any money is good money, and the most important thing was the issuing of legal licenses. Without a license, spiritual energy users trained on Rage Owl Star would be fine operating on their home planet. But as Rage Owl Star stabilized and society became relatively stable, it was bound to take to the interstellar stage. Then, given the Empire's controlling policy towards spiritual energy users, lacking legal identity could easily lead to issues outside of their home star. From now on, this would no longer be a concern. Moreover, apart from matters related to spiritual energy, Gu Hang's recent surge in fame brought another significant benefit. Through the Gu commercial firm, he found many investors and signed several investment contracts. The planet's industrial capacity did not require foreign investment. The alliance's economic system focused more on planned economics, with money and market functions playing a supporting role, so attracting a large influx of foreign investors for development wasn't necessary. However, trade was indispensable. The alliance had ample production capacity, and a significant portion of that capacity had no outlet for consumption. Even if all output went towards paying taxes, the excess tax currency couldn't just sit idle, there had to be trade and order fulfillment to translate the extra capability into income. And although the alliance could be self-sustaining with its rich production capacity, it still required input from outside sources. As production expanded, the demand for raw materials would inevitably increase. Mining, logging, farming, these activities would, of course, be developed on Rage Owl Star, but it was prudent to plan ahead. Establishing a trade route for resource input was also advantageous. With the backing of the Gu commercial firm, Gu Heng wasn't worried about lacking channels for interstellar trade. But there was a huge problem: what about the starport? Rage Owl Star did have a starport, but it was too small. Accommodating several 100,000 members of the mobile Star Realm army required several days. In the context of large-scale interstellar trade, it was utterly insufficient for exchanges involving tens of millions, even billions of tax currency worth of goods. The starport simply didn't have the capacity. And currently, the largest vessel that could dock at Rage Owl Star's starport was at the escort ship level. The giant belly transport ship, a popular choice for interstellar trade, couldn't dock there at all. Gu Heng had a complete set of blueprints for constructing a large starport and faced no technological bottlenecks. Below the starport in Skaro City, which had a population of 500,000 residents, the area had transformed from a barren land into the largest city in Xianja province in less than a year. Almost all of these 500,000 people had come to construct the starport. Even if they weren't directly involved in construction, they were at least transporting materials, supporting personnel and logistics, managing the ground operations, or working in medical care and law enforcement. Of course, the core focus out of this plethora of associated jobs was still the construction of the starport. However, despite the large workforce dedicated to the task, the construction progress of the starport was painfully slow. When Gu Heng spoke about this with his mother, she stared at him with disbelief for quite a while. "What do you think a starport is? You've only started building for less than a year. Those massive starports you've seen on other planets, didn't all of them take decades, even a century of use and expansion, to slowly become what they are now? Don't expect to get rich overnight." But Gu Heng did want to get rich overnight. So what was the solution to accelerate construction? Seeking external investment. The current construction method of the Alliance involved firing orbital spacecraft in fits and starts, carrying only a small portion of parts produced on the ground, or one or two construction machines, into space at a time. Then workers, encumbered by spacesuits that greatly hindered their movements, had to perform space operations. Chapter 520. Gu Heng now has a full set of blueprints and technology, but many of the construction methods simply weren't feasible to realize. However, with external investment, things would be much easier. He could hire large engineering vessels to do the job, which would be far more reliable than engineering machines. He could directly purchase mass-produced, super large components, transport them here, and have the engineering vessels equip them. In short, if he had enough money, Gu Heng estimated that he could expand the Rage Owl starport to several hundred times its current size within 1 to 2 years. Saving up such a large sum of money on his own, through deception and trickery, or even with the support of the Gu commercial firm, was no longer sufficient. It was necessary to bring in strong investors. After Miss Wang Qi learned about her son's ambition, she actively started pulling strings and found some initially interested parties. In the past, this investment project would probably have attracted no interest. But now, Gu Heng had demonstrated a certain capability, the Rage Bear Legion had made a name for itself, and people began to slowly believe that investing in Rage Owl, a previously desolate planet, could be profitable. Of course, these investors were still very cautious, willing to invest only tens of thousands, or at most hundreds of thousands, of tax currency. Our latest chapters at Frihognovlo only. This amount was hardly sufficient for Gu Heng's grand plans. Still, he was not one to turn away any comers. Setting an early example was essential. Even scammers know to give a taste of sweetness first, and Gu Heng intended to let those willing to invest in building the starport make money from it. As for later, with the starport built in Rage Owl's orbit, and Gu Heng armed with guns and cannons, no need to say more. However, at the moment, Gu Heng's main reputation was still focused on his identity as an A-level spiritual energy user and the young family head of the Gu family. This type of reputation didn't have as much pull in attracting investors. If the Rage Bear Legion could put on a stellar performance on the battlefield of Karolia 3, that would undoubtedly be a bonus. Everyone knew that both the troops and equipment of the Rage Bear Legion came from Rage Owl itself. The combat effectiveness of an army could illustrate the comprehensive strength of a planet from all aspects, making it a massive billboard. The value of reputation lay right there. Beyond the value of reputation, if the Rage Bear Legion could achieve even better results here, they would reap other direct benefits. Politically, it would help to strengthen relations with surrounding political powers. Helping the Empire world beat the plague demons was undoubtedly doing the right thing. The achievements of the Rage Bear Legion would ultimately be attributed to Gu Hang. As the Legion commander and a provisional general, if his merits were great enough later on, would the Star Domain military headquarters not consider promoting his military rank and improving his benefits? Of course, this would be very important for those who are fully integrated into the Star Realm army system, but for Gu Hang, the cost-effectiveness was not very high. Even if his military rank were to soar and his duties increase, he could not abandon his base and merge into the Star Realm Army's circle. But just as his entry into the Imperial Psychic Association, and becoming a senior figure within the Dragonhawk Star Domain Association, brought him a series of benefits in that system, so too would rising to a higher status in the Star Realm Army through the growth and strength of the Rage Bear Legion bring direct benefits. For example, the Rage Bear Legion might be granted expansion not from Rage Owl itself, but the Military Affairs Department directly enlarging the army, providing troops and equipment. All Star Realm Army Corps operate in this manner. At that time, Gu Hang would essentially gain an army for nothing. The expenses for maintaining the army could be claimed back from the Military Affairs Department. And to speak of even more direct benefits, there were others. Wars produce spoils. The Rage Bear Legion strictly followed the Alliance Army's customs, disallowing looting and requiring unconditional surrender of all unclaimed spoils gathered after battle. In the Alliance, these surrendered items would eventually enter the national treasury, soldiers would receive combat allowances, rank advancements due to valor, and the dead and injured would receive generous compensation. But on the battlefield of Karolia, there was no such rule. The highest level for surrender was at the corps level. The demons killed by the troops in battle had value, and the corresponding logistics would deal with the biological materials from the bodies remaining after the demons' spirits were expelled. The logistics took a portion of the fees, and the rest went to the corps. Moreover, when certain areas were recovered, and many of the local population were dead, the property left behind by the residents also became the possession of the corps. Li Kexi was somewhat at a loss, he had never dealt with this sort of thing before. He had previously thought it necessary to hand over the funds to the Military Affairs Department and even consulted with the Dragonhawk Legion about it, only to find out it wasn't necessary. Later, following an inquiry to Gu Hang, the Legion commander decided, the money would be taken as property of the Legion and lent in full to the Alliance government. And the Alliance government would establish a Legion Foundation, dedicated to consolations, extra allowances for the Rage Bear Legion warriors, ammunition replenishment, logistics maintenance, and the like. Of course, it could also be used for other purposes, but the foundation had to pay interest, whatever the case. It was essentially a case of money changing hands from the left pocket to the right. However, extra allowances and additional consolations did greatly help with the morale of the Rage Bear Legion. The Alliance Army never had to worry about morale. On the one hand, soldiers trained systematically possessed an inherently high level of organization. They were resolute, disciplined, and spirited. On the other hand, the Alliance Army was a force with a belief system, previously mainly engaged in combat on the planet of Rage Owl Star. Political officers always emphasized to the soldiers that their fight was for the future of the entire planet, for the happiness of all humanity. However, in extraterrestrial combat, this belief was somewhat challenged. Despite that, the political officers could offer another set of ideologies. First was the loyalty to Mr. Gu, which was unquestionable and recognized by all the warriors. Second was transforming the For Our World message into For All of Humanity. However, this message wasn't quite as effective. The former had already been grand enough, and many had come to accept this belief after experiencing firsthand the massive changes to themselves, their families, friends, and the entire planet. But the latter was even grander and more abstract. What was more terrifying was the lack of visible change. They had fought for half a year, but to be honest, had the situation in Pheno City improved at all? It had not, in fact, it was getting worse. The soldiers were willing to accept that they were fighting for humanity, but their acceptance was low, and the situation, without any outcomes or changes, inevitably caused some distress. At such times, better allowances and improved conditions served as a material financial reward and played a role in compensation. Gu Hang also clarified in his meeting with Li Kexi that they would fight for at most another half year. He would dispatch another half of the Rage Bear Legion from Rage Owl Star for rotation, letting the warriors who had fought for a long time have a chance to return home for rest, reunite with their families, and enjoy life a bit. All the benefits and interests obtained by the Rage Bear Legion there, whether direct or indirect, whether in terms of prestige, politics, or economics, all depended on the efforts and command of Li Kexi and his soldiers in battle. They were earned with the blood of the warriors. After half a year of fighting, all 7 divisions were under strength. A total of more than 13,000 warriors had been killed or injured, with over 8,000 dead, and more than 5,000 severely injured and confirmed to be unable to return to the unit. Gu Heng visited the battlefield hospital to console the injured. He promised to bring back the casualties and the remains of the fallen to their hometowns. They would receive grand funerals and generous consolations. Gu Heng did as he promised. The remains of more than 5,000 soldiers who had been withdrawn from the combat sequence, along with the bodies that could be recovered, were transported through the Star Realm Army's logistical system to the starport on Karolia and placed aboard the armed merchant ship of the Gu commercial firm, which was also carrying Gu Heng as he departed. Besides, there were others joining them on their journey. A survey team, composed of around 20 people, mainly from the Star Domain Survey Team, with 3 observers from the Space Domain Government's Survey Group. There was also a team of investors. Many tycoons, involved in the Galaraldo disappearance case and unable to leave Karolia, managed to send some investment consultants and trusted subordinates to inspect the value of Mr. Gu's planet alongside him. In addition, the largest group, consisting of 210,000 refugees set to be evacuated to Rage Owl Star, were loaded onto an accompanying transport ship.